She was the most powerful woman in the empire, and they made her stand alone in the middle of a ballroom while 1,000 people pretended not to notice. Alpha King Ryker Ashthorn didn't need a blade to destroy his Luna. He used a smile, the kind he used to save only for her. The moment he turned that smile toward another woman in front of the entire court, something inside Seraphina Vale didn't break. It decided. And what a woman decides in her darkest moment determines everything that comes after. Stay until the end. You're going to want to witness every second of what she builds from the wreckage he left her. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know exactly where in this world people still understand what loyalty costs. The Moon Palace had a particular way of swallowing sound. Not all sound. Not the clinking of crystal goblets, not the scrape of silver against porcelain, not the practiced laughter of nobility performing contentment for an audience of rivals. Those sounds the palace amplified. They bounced off the vaulted ceilings with their carved stone wolves mid-howl, off the walls draped in ashthorn silver and black, off the polished floors that reflected the chandelier light, until the entire grand hall seemed to float inside a star. What the Moon Palace swallowed was the sound of a woman absorbing a blow. Luna Seraphina Vale stood at her assigned place at the high table, 3 chairs from the center, which was already the first indication of where the evening intended to wound her, and she heard the announcement the way you hear something you've been bracing for since the moment you woke up that morning. Not with shock, with the grim recognition of a soldier who finally hears the cannon fire they knew was coming. Alpha King Ryker Ashthorn had just named Lady Evelise Crestfall as his official companion for the royal summit. The applause was immediate, enthusiastic, the kind of applause that emerges when a room full of people exhales collective relief that someone else is bearing the weight of an awkward truth they've all been pretending not to see. Seraphina did not applaud. She lifted her glass instead, brought it to her lips. Let the cold burn of the wine settle in her chest alongside everything else that had taken up permanent residence there. Then she set the glass down with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know. Because the thing about absorbing blows with grace is that the effort becomes invisible. An invisible effort earns no credit from anyone. Across the hall, Ryker was smiling. Not the public smile, not the alpha's smile. The one calculated for distance and authority, the one that said, I am in command of this moment and every moment that follows. This was something else. This was the unguarded version. The one where the lines around his eyes deepened and his jaw lost its kingdom-bearing tension, and he looked for just a moment like a man who was genuinely helplessly happy. She knew that smile. She had spent 4 years being the only person alive who got to see it. That was the part that cut past bone. Not that he was smiling at Evelise Crestfall, not that he had named her publicly, officially, in front of every noble house and visiting dignitary and foreign ambassador who would carry this story home and add it to the growing ledger of evidence that the Luna of the Ashthorn Empire had become a formality. What cut past bone was the specific quality of the smile, that it was real, that whatever Ryker felt when he looked at Evelise, it was not performed, it was not political. It was the truest thing he'd shown in public in years, and it was aimed somewhere else. Seraphina reached for her wine again and decided that the evening would end precisely as it had begun, with her upright, composed, and giving nothing away to the wolves who were already watching to see how the Luna bled. She had met Evelise Crestfall 3 years and 8 months ago at a border negotiation in the Thornfield provinces. Lady Evelise had arrived as part of a minor noble delegation, one of a dozen faces in a room Seraphina had been running strategically for 2 days before the official talks began. She had the particular beauty of someone who understood its uses without being enslaved to them. Dark hair, dark eyes, a precision of movement that suggested someone who had trained themselves to take up exactly as much space as the moment required. Not more, not less. Seraphina had noticed her because Seraphina noticed everything. It was a survival mechanism that had calcified into professional instinct across 4 years of navigating a court that was friendly to her face and calculating behind her back. What she had not anticipated was that Ryker would notice Evelise too. What she had not anticipated was that he would keep noticing. The thing about emotional betrayal is that it rarely arrives with a declaration. There is no moment where a man looks at his mate and announces that he has begun to redirect himself. It happens in increments so small that each individual one is dismissible. A longer conversation here, a private council meeting there, a preference for Evelise's strategic counsel on matters where Seraphina's input had previously been sought first. A canceled dinner, once, because there was a border situation requiring his attention, and Evelise happened to be the most qualified person present to assist with it. These were all, individually, reasonable. Together, over time, they formed something else. They formed the slow architecture of a man unconsciously building a life that no longer had his Luna at its center. And the cruelest part of that architecture was that he never stopped believing he loved her. Seraphina retired to her chambers at 10 minutes past midnight. Not because the gathering was over. It wasn't. It would run until the early hours, fueled by Ashthorn wine and political maneuvering and the particular electricity of a court that had just witnessed a significant power shift and was now busy reorganizing its allegiances accordingly. She left because staying another hour served no purpose beyond giving the wolves better viewing angles of her composure, and she had long since stopped performing for audiences that had already made up their minds. Mira was waiting for her. Mira Tane, her personal attendant for 6 years, who had the kind of face that was constitutionally incapable of hiding what it felt, which meant she had spent the last 6 years unconsciously telegraphing every difficult thing before she said it. Tonight her face said, "I saw. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say." "Don't," Seraphina said before she could start. "My lady," I said, "don't." She crossed to the window. The city below the palace was still awake, still lit, the commercial districts buzzing with the overflow crowd that always gathered outside during major court events, hoping to catch some fraction of the pageantry. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unbothered by the particular arithmetic of royal betrayal. She envied them in the abstract way you envy people who don't know what they don't know. "Get me out of this," she added, reaching up to touch the back fastenings of the formal gown. The quick way. Mira's hands were steady even when everything else about her was distressed. 6 years had made her efficient. She worked the fastenings loose in under 2 minutes, and Seraphina stepped out of silver silk and stood at the window in the plain underdress beneath, arms crossed, watching the city. "It's going to be talked about," Mira said, quietly. She was folding the gown with more care than it deserved. "Tomorrow, the whole court. I know. They'll say, I know what they'll say, Mira." She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "I've been listening to what they say for 3 years. I have an excellent working knowledge of the catalog by now." Mira said nothing for a moment. Then, "What do you want me to do?" It was such a simple question, the simplest possible question. And Seraphina stood there with her forehead against glass that was slowly warming with her body heat, and she found, as she had been finding more often lately, in the private moments when there was no performance required, that she did not have an answer. What did she want? When had that stopped being a question she knew how to approach? "Draw a bath," she said finally. "The hot one. Leave me alone after." That's all. The morning council convened at 7, as always. Seraphina arrived at 6:45, as always. She had been doing this for 4 years, arriving before the meeting officially began, positioning herself at the secondary table where the analytical work happened, so that when Ryker entered and the formal session started, she was already embedded in the documentation, already useful, already demonstrating the specific quality of presence that made her indispensable in rooms that increasingly preferred to forget she was there. This morning, 3 council members who previously sat near her chose seats on the opposite side of the table. She noticed. She said nothing. Councillor Dren, who was old enough to have served 3 administrations and shameless enough to have survived all of them, settled into his chair with the particular caution of a man lowering himself onto uncertain ground. He looked at her directly, which was more than most were doing this morning, and said, "Luna, you look well." "Thank you, Counselor." "The summit preparation is going smoothly?" "As smoothly as these things go." She kept her eyes on the document in front of her. Troop rotation schedules for the Northern Corridor, nothing sensitive, just the mechanical work of keeping an empire running. "The Crimson Dominion delegation arrives in 12 days. We should discuss the Eastern Trade Annex." "Of course." He hesitated. "Lady Evelise has offered some thoughts on the Trade Annex as well." She looked up. Dren met her eyes with something in his that was not exactly apology, and not exactly not apology. It was the expression of a man who understood that he was saying something painful and had decided to say it anyway, on the theory that the pain of forewarning was smaller than the pain of surprise. "Has she?" Seraphina said. "At last night's gathering, after you—" He stopped. "She spoke with several of the Eastern House representatives. Apparently she has some history with the Dominion's trade envoy." "Apparently." She looked back down at the document. "I'll review her thoughts." The council filed in over the next 10 minutes. Ryker entered at 7 precisely, which he always did not because he was punctual by nature, but because he was precise by discipline. He crossed to the head of the table, took his seat, and the meeting began. He did not look at her. Not immediately. But after the first agenda item, when she raised a point about the troop rotation that required his direct response, he turned toward her with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided in advance what his expression will be, and he said, "That's a good point, Seraphina. Councillor Torvin, note the Luna's recommendation." Luna. Not Sarah. Not the shortened version that had been his private name for her since before they were formally mated, back when he was still the kind of man who used private names. Luna. The title, the office, the managed distance. She gave him a nod that was exactly as neutral as his expression and returned to the document. Lunch was solitary by design. She ate in her personal study, surrounded by correspondence she actually needed to answer, and correspondence she was only reviewing to understand the political landscape. And she was 3 letters into the second category when a knock at the door announced a visitor she had not expected. "Come." The door opened to admit Alpha King Darius Blackthorn. He was taller than she remembered from the formal portrait she'd reviewed in preparation for the summit. The portrait had the general royal flatness of commissioned work, which tended to sand off the specific quality of a person and replace it with a kind of aspirational symmetry. In person, Darius Blackthorn had no interest in aspirational symmetry. He was broad through the shoulder in the manner of a man who came by it honestly rather than decoratively, with the weathered look of someone who spent time outdoors in actual weather rather than ceremonial outdoors in curated weather, and his eyes were the dark gray of river water on an overcast day, sharp, still, reading the room in fractions of a second. He was 12 days early. Alpha Blackthorn. She set down her letter. Did not stand. In any other circumstance, she would have. Protocol demanded it. But she was in her private study. This was an unannounced visit. And she had learned long ago that the first thing she yielded always became the floor of what she was expected to yield next. "Your delegation wasn't expected until the 14th. "My delegation arrives on the 14th, he said. His voice had a roughness to it, the kind that came from giving orders across distances rather than from behind them. "I came ahead. Privately." "Privately," she repeated, "without notifying the king, without notifying anyone." He looked at the room, the letters, the maps pinned to the side wall, the untouched lunch at the corner of her desk, with a directness that wasn't rude so much as unself-conscious. Like a man who had learned that pretending not to observe things was a waste of time available for actually observing them. "You are aware that your own court is currently organizing itself into factions over last night's announcement." "I'm aware. The Eastern House representatives are being courted by Lady Evelise's people." "I'm aware of that too. 3 of the northern trade families sent messengers to my private receiving rooms before I'd unpacked." He moved further into the study, uninvited, and she let it happen because she was curious enough about where this was going to override the part of her that wanted to assert the boundary. They were under the impression that the Crimson Dominion's relationship with this empire might be reassessed based on the summit outcome. "What did you tell them?" "That I don't make decisions based on court drama." He stopped at the side wall, looked at the map, his hands clasped behind his back with the ease of someone comfortable with silences. "I was lying, of course. All rulers make decisions based on court drama. It's the primary material we work with." She studied him. "What do you actually want, Alpha Blackthorn?" "Darius?" He turned from the map. "We're going to be having several significant conversations over the next 2 weeks." The title gets heavy. "What do you want, Darius?" He looked at her with those river water eyes, and he said something that nobody in this palace had said to her in a very long time. Not because they were incapable of the words, but because the answer had stopped mattering to them enough to ask for it. "I want to understand what you want," he said. Before we talk about anything else, before we talk about trade annexes or summit positioning or what the Eastern houses are doing, what do you want? From this summit, from this situation, he paused. From any of this. Seraphina Vale, Luna of the Ashthorn Empire, who had held herself together through 3.5 years of incremental erasure with a steadiness that would have broken most people and had broken her in private ways, she catalogued at 3 in the morning but never showed in daylight. Felt something move in her chest that was not the familiar dull ache of practiced containment. It was something more dangerous than that. It was the specific vertigo of being seen. "That's a strange opening," she said carefully. "It's an honest one." He didn't move toward her, didn't alter the comfortable distance between them, gave her nothing that required a defensive response. Just stood there with his hands behind his back and his river water eyes patient in the way of a man who has learned that the information people offer freely is always more useful than anything you extract. In my experience, when someone in a difficult position can't answer that question, it's because they've been so thoroughly occupied with what other people need from them that they've misplaced the answer somewhere they can no longer find it. A pause, then, but the answer is still there. It doesn't actually disappear. "You," Seraphina said, "are considerably more complicated than your portrait suggested." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the precursor to one. Portraits are diplomatic documents. They're not supposed to suggest anything inconvenient. Ryker found her that evening on the East Terrace, which had been her place since before they were mated, the place she came when she needed sky and stone instead of ceilings and politeness. He came alone, which meant he had made the calculation that this was a conversation for privacy, and he stood beside her at the railing with his forearms on the stone and looked out at the valley below the palace with the expression of a man composing an opening line. She gave him no help with it. "Last night," he started. "Yes." "It wasn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I want you to understand the context. The summit is politically delicate. Evelisse has existing relationships with several of the Dominion-adjacent territories. Her position as my companion during the formal events is a strategic—" "Ryker." Her voice was level. Not cold. Level. Which was worse, in the way that a calm sea before a storm is worse than rough water, because at least rough water tells you the truth about what it is. "I know what you're going to say." He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the valley. "You're going to tell me it's strategic," she continued, "that you chose her for this because she serves a political function and not because you wanted to. That you still need me in the ways that matter. That whatever this looks like, I am still your Luna, and that means something real to you." She paused. "I've heard the shape of this speech before. The details change. The shape doesn't." Silence. "Tell me I'm wrong," she said. And there was something in her voice then. Not an invitation, not a challenge. A genuine question asked by someone who would genuinely like the answer to be something other than what she expects. He said nothing. "Right," she said. "Sarah, don't." She finally looked at him then, and what he saw on her face was not anger, which would have been manageable, and not grief, which would have required comfort he knew how to offer. What he saw was something quieter and more final than either of those. Something that had been arriving for a long time and had simply, tonight, arrived. "I'm not going to have this conversation with you again. Not this version. I'm done with this version." "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what I said." "Seraphina, you called me Luna this morning," she said. "In council, in front of everyone. Not Sarah, not your mate's name. The title. You know what that means. I know what that means. Every person in that council chamber knows what that means." She turned back to the valley. "We've been conducting a very polite fiction for quite some time, you and I am running out of the energy required to maintain my end of it." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him trying to organize his thoughts into something that would work, the way he always did. Ryker was a man who believed in the power of the right argument to resolve any situation, which was an excellent quality in a king and a devastating one in a mate, because some situations don't resolve through argument. Some situations are already resolved. The argument is just a delay. "You know you're the one I truly need," he said. She had heard this before. Verbatim. The exact sentence. delivered with the same gravity and the same sincerity that made it, each time, both obviously true and somehow completely beside the point. Need, she thought. Not love, not cherish, not want. Need. She said nothing. He waited another moment, then straightened, and she heard the familiar rearrangement of him back into the public self. The shoulders settling into their alpha configuration, the jaw picking up its governing tension, the man retreating behind the king because the man didn't know what to do with the silence she was offering him. Get some rest, he said. The summit preparation begins in earnest tomorrow. He left. She stood at the railing for a long time after, looking at the valley, and she felt very clearly and very specifically the moment when something inside her that had been straining against its own limits for years simply stopped straining. Not because it gave up, because it let go. There is a difference. Most people never learn what it is. The ones who do tend to find in the aftermath of that releasing that they had been expending enormous amounts of energy on something that never intended to hold them back, and that the absence of that expenditure creates a strange, dangerous clarity about what they are actually capable of. Seraphina stood at the railing and felt, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely awake. Darius found her the next morning in the palace archives, not because he had been looking for her, or not only because of that. He had been looking at the historical trade documents the Empire kept under careful lock, the ones that predated the current Ashthorn dynasty, and she had been doing the same thing from a different angle. The Luna's access to the archives was technically broader than the Alpha King's honored guests' access, which was one of the few institutional recognitions of her position that had not yet been quietly eroded. He appeared at the end of the aisle she was working through and stopped, reading the shelving. The pre-consolidation records? The pre-consolidation records. She pulled a document carefully. The Eastern trade families that are currently being courted by Lady Evelisa's people have a history that begins before this empire's current form. Understanding the original agreements helps me understand the leverage points. You're positioning for the summit. I'm doing what I do. I've been doing it for 4 years. Most people in this palace have stopped noticing that I do it, which is partly why the empire's trade infrastructure has functioned so well. The person managing it became invisible enough that nobody interfered. She set the document on the reading table. Sit down if you're going to stay. He sat. Without ceremony, without the careful political staging of a formal meeting, with the easy directness she was already recognizing as his native mode of operation. Yesterday, he said, my question, you didn't answer it. I noticed. I'm asking again. She looked at him across the table. The archive was quiet around them, the good silence of old paper and organized knowledge, the kind of room that made you feel that the past was accessible if you asked correctly. She had always found archives steadying for exactly this reason. I want, she said slowly, to find out what I'm capable of when I'm not spending most of my available resources on holding something else together. Darius nodded, once. That's an honest answer. You asked an honest question. What would you do, he said, if the framework changed, if you weren't the Luna of this empire, if that entire architecture fell away, what would you do with yourself? She thought about it, genuinely thought, the way she allowed herself to think in private but rarely in conversation, without the automatic edit that checked each emerging thought for its palatability. I'd build something, she said. What kind of something? Something that actually worked. Something that didn't require me to be invisible to survive. She paused. Something I could put my name on. Darius looked at her for a moment, with those patient gray eyes that she was starting to understand were not merely patient, but strategic. That the patience was not passivity, but a choice. The same way her composure was a choice. The same way silence could be a choice that contained more information than speech. The Crimson Dominion, he said carefully, has been looking to formalize its eastern expansion through a combination of trade infrastructure and strategic advisory architecture. We have the military backing and the territory. We have significant gaps in the kind of institutional knowledge that turns territory into sustainable empire. She was quiet. I'm not making an offer, he said. I'm telling you a fact. It sounds like an offer with plausible deniability. It sounds like a man telling a woman who just said she wants to build something that there is approximately 12 days' ride from here, a very large thing that needs building. She looked down at the pre-consolidation documents, the old trade routes, the original agreements between houses that no longer existed in their original form, absorbed and redrawn by time and conflict and the specific appetite of the Ashthorn dynasty for consolidation. She thought about Ryker on the terrace. "You know you're the one I truly need." She thought about the 3 council seats that had moved away from her this morning. She thought about what Mira's face had looked like after the announcement, and about the moon bond, and about the specific weight of 4 years of pouring herself into an institution that had decided she was furniture. "Tell me about your Eastern expansion," she said. And Darius Blackthorne settled back in his chair with the ease of a man who has been patient for the right moment and finally feels it arrive. And he began to talk. What no one in the Moon Palace understood, what Ryker, in his genuine, complicated, politically entangled love for Seraphina, did not understand, and what Evelise Crestfall in her calculated ascent through the court did not understand, and what every noble house repositioning itself in the wake of last night's announcement did not understand, was that Seraphina Vale had never been the Luna because Ryker gave her the position. She had been the Luna because she was the most competent political and strategic intelligence in the Empire, and the title had been the container the Empire placed around her to make that competence legible to itself. Remove the title, and the competence remained. This is the mistake powerful institutions make about the people who hold them up. They confuse the container with the contents. They look at the vessel and forget there is water inside. When the vessel is taken away or set aside, they imagine the water disappears with it. It doesn't. Water finds its own level. It always does. The Grand Moon Festival fell on the 23rd day of the summit preparation cycle, which meant it had been carefully scheduled to coincide with the visiting delegation's presence, a display of Ashthorn power and tradition for foreign eyes, the kind of event that packed political meaning into cultural form and allowed the Empire to demonstrate cohesion without requiring anyone to explicitly discuss it. Seraphina had helped plan it. She had, in fact, helped plan the last 3 of them, in the particular behind-the-scenes way she helped plan most things in this palace, present enough to be useful, structured invisibly enough that the credit aggregated elsewhere. She stood at her assigned position as the ceremonial music began. The chandeliers threw silver light across a ballroom packed with 2,000 witnesses. Every noble house, every visiting delegation, every foreign ruler and ambassador and strategic observer who had made the calculation that this particular summit was worth attending in person. The ceremonial dance was old. It predated the current dynasty by several generations. The Alpha King led his Luna onto the floor, and the court followed, and the Empire performed its unity for the assembled world. Seraphina was wearing the formal silver of the Luna. She had dressed deliberately, not with the automatic motion of someone going through required ritual, but with the specific, conscious intention of a woman who wants to remember the last time she wears something. The gown was exquisite. She had never particularly cared for it, but she had worn it correctly at every formal event for 4 years. And tonight she wore it with that same correctness, with that same composure. Because, whatever was coming, she would not give this room the gift of watching her flinch first. The music reached its appointed moment. Ryker extended his hand and turned toward Evelise. The sound that moved through the ballroom was the kind of sound that isn't quite sound. It's air leaving lungs simultaneously, a held breath released, the atmospheric shift of 2,000 people registering something at the same moment. The gasps were quiet, polite, controlled, because this was a court that had learned to contain its reactions. But they were there. Seraphina stood. The silver chandeliers poured light over her, and she stood in it, and she did not move, and she did not look at the floor, and she did not look at Ryker and Evelise moving onto the dance floor as the court scrambled to follow an awkward, stumbling, avoiding her gaze reconfiguration. She stood beneath the crystal lights while the whispers spread. She stood while the most powerful people on the continent watched a woman be publicly, officially, irreversibly placed second. And then she smiled. It was not a smile of forgiveness. It was not performance, not the managed composure she had spent 4 years perfecting. It was something else, something that arrived from a much deeper level. The smile of a woman who has just understood something she had been on the verge of understanding for a very long time, who has finally felt the last piece settle into place, who sees the complete picture clearly for the first time. Ryker had never believed she would leave. That was the truth at the center of everything. He had never, in 4 years of incremental choices and strategic distances, and you know you're the one I truly need, believed that Seraphina Vale would actually go. He had treated her devotion as a fixed property of the universe, a constant, a thing that operated regardless of what he offered in return, the way gravity operates regardless of whether you acknowledge it. He had mistaken devotion for weakness. He had mistaken staying for being unable to leave. She thought of Darius Blackthorne in the archive, with his river water eyes and his patient waiting, and his "there is a very large thing that needs building." She thought of his voice saying, "I want to understand what you want." She thought of what she had said in return, "I want to find out what I'm capable of." The music moved through the ballroom. The Alpha King danced with Lady Evelise, and Luna Seraphina Vale stood in the silver light of the Moon Palace's grandest hall and felt, with complete and terrible clarity, that she was done. Not angry, not broken, not uncertain. Done. She left the ballroom at precisely the moment when leaving would be noticed, but could not yet be responded to. That narrow window of social timing she had learned to read with absolute precision over 4 years of navigating a court that observed everything and commented on everything and filed everything away for future use. In the corridor outside, she breathed. In the clean, stone-cooled air of the corridor, away from the heat of 2,000 bodies and the weight of the chandelier's judgment, she breathed, and she did not shake, and she did not cry, and she did not wait for someone to come after her. She already knew no one would. She went to the archives, not because she had planned to go there, but because she had been spending time there over the last 12 days, and her body had begun to orient toward it the way bodies orient toward places that feel like something. Safe was the wrong word. She didn't need safe. True was closer. The archive felt true in a way the rest of the palace no longer did. Darius was already there. She stopped in the doorway. He was at the reading table where they had spent 4 of the last 12 mornings going through Eastern Expansion documentation, and he looked up when she came in with the quick alertness of a man who has been waiting for something, who felt it arrive. He looked at her face. He said nothing for a moment. "Sit down," he said finally. She sat. They stayed like that for a long time, in the quiet of old paper and organized knowledge, while the ballroom 2 wings away continued its music and its performances and its 2,000-person witnessing of the specific mechanics of what a powerful empire does to a woman it has decided it no longer needs to respect. "I'm going," she said, eventually. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't addressed to him specifically, or to anyone specifically. It was the sound of a decision completing itself. The audio of a door closing. Not slamming. Closing. Darius looked at her with those gray eyes, and he said, "I know." "There's something I need to do first," she said. "Take whatever time you need." "One night?" She looked at her hands on the table. The Luna's hands. 4 years of documents and correspondence and strategic assessments, all of it invisible to the people who benefited from it most. "I have one thing to do tonight, and then tomorrow I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded. No argument, no pressure. The particular respect of someone who understands that a woman deciding the shape of her own departure deserves the timing she chooses. She left the archive and went back through the palace corridors, past guards who nodded at the Luna's silver, past servants who didn't quite meet her eyes, past a court that was still rearranging itself in the aftermath of what the ballroom had just displayed. She went to the chamber where the moon bond's ritual objects were kept. The moon bond was old, older than the current dynasty, older than the Ashthorn name, a formal articulation of the mating link in material and ceremonial form. Breaking it required specific knowledge and specific access, both of which she had, because for 4 years she had been the Luna, and the Luna was given access to everything under the assumption that she would always remain within the system that granted it. The assumption was wrong. She spent 3 hours. When she finished, she was tired in the specific way that comes from completing something that required everything you had. Not empty, complete. There is a difference that most people never locate in themselves. She went back to her chambers. She did not sleep. By the time the first gray light of morning began pressing against the east windows, she had written 3 letters, one to the staff she trusted, one that would find its way to certain diplomatic contacts, and one that she left on the desk in her study, addressed in Ryker's name, sealed with the Luna's seal, which she would no longer be entitled to use after today. She packed what she needed in 2 cases, deliberately, without excess. Then Seraphina Vale, who had been the most invisible important woman in the Ashthorn Empire for 4 years, walked out of the Moon Palace with her cases and her completed letters and her clarity that felt like cold water and sunrise simultaneously. And she did not leave a farewell, and she did not leave an explanation. She left the letter, and she walked toward a waiting carriage, and a waiting road, and a waiting conversation with a king who had asked her what she wanted, and had been willing to hear the answer. Isheb. What she did not know, and would not know until weeks later, was what happened in the Moon Palace in the hours after she left. The bond severance was felt first, not by Ryker, which is the way these things go, because the person who severs the bond always feels it cleanest. The one it's severed from feels it as a particular wrongness in the air, a static at the edges of perception that the mind tries to rationalize as atmospheric, as fatigue, as the residue of a difficult night. Ryker felt it at dawn. He was in his private study reviewing summit documentation when it hit him. He would describe it later, to no one, as the sensation of a door closing in a house you didn't know had another room. The awareness, sudden and total, that something had been there that wasn't there anymore, and that its absence revealed a shape you had not previously understood. He found the letter 2 hours later. It was not long. She had never been a woman who wasted words. It said, "I'm not angry. I'm not broken. I'm finished. Don't look for me. You won't find what you're looking for." Ryker read it 4 times. Then he stood in the silent study and understood, for the first time, what it meant to lose something you had been so certain was permanent that you had forgotten to treat it accordingly. He called for his trackers. He gave them her description and her direction and the resources of the most powerful empire on the continent and told them to find the Luna and bring her home. What he did not yet know, what would arrive in stages over the following weeks, each piece more devastating than the last, was that Seraphina Vale had not simply left him. She had left the empire, and she had taken something with her. Not gold, not documents, not anything that could be named in an inventory. She had taken the specific knowledge of how everything fit together, the web of relationships and intelligence, an institutional understanding that she had been quietly building and maintaining for 4 years, the invisible architecture of an empire's actual function. The difference between an empire that looks powerful and an empire that is powerful. The difference between a king who is feared and a kingdom that actually works. Ryker's trackers reached the border. They were met by a Crimson Dominion escort, a single messenger carrying a single document addressed in a handwriting the lead tracker recognized as the Luna's. The document stated in precise and legally unimpeachable terms that the Luna of the Ashthorn Empire had sought and been granted formal political sanctuary in the Crimson Dominion under the existing diplomatic conventions between the 2 kingdoms, and that any action by Ashthorn forces on Dominion territory in pursuit of her person would constitute a violation of those conventions and would be treated accordingly. The tracker returned to the palace. He delivered his report. Ryker sat with the information for a long time. Then he sent for his senior counsel and his military advisors, and he began to understand, in the full, unsparing daylight of the morning after everything, that the woman he had watched stand alone beneath chandeliers had not been disappearing. She had been preparing. And in the silence of that understanding, something in the Moon Palace shifted. The particular, irreversible shift of a system that has just lost the element it didn't know was load-bearing and cannot yet calculate what that loss means for the structure it has spent 4 years assuming was solid. The East Wing's correspondence went unanswered for 3 days. Not because the staff was incompetent. They were not. Because Seraphina had been the one who understood which correspondence actually required answering, and without her, they were left with the full, unedited volume of it, and no way to tell the essential from the noise. The Eastern trade families sent a joint inquiry, formally addressed to the king, requesting clarification on the summit agenda. The inquiry touched on 7 specific points. Ryker recognized perhaps 3 of them. The other 4 had been operating at a level of his empire that he had never been required to understand directly, because she had been the one understanding it. On the 5th day, a letter arrived from the Crimson Dominion. It was addressed to the king of the Ashthorn Empire and signed by Alpha King Darius Blackthorn. It was brief. It was courteous. It was, in its perfect diplomatic correctness, the most devastating document Ryker had ever received. It stated that the Crimson Dominion looked forward to the upcoming summit, that Alpha King Blackthorn would be attending as planned, and that he was pleased to announce that his new chief strategic advisor would be accompanying him in an official capacity. Her name, her full name, with her new title. In a document addressed to the king she had left, Ryker set the letter on his desk. He stared at the title beneath her name, Chief Strategic Advisor to the Crown of the Crimson Dominion, and the specific quality of that stare was not the look of a man reading information. It was the look of a man beginning to understand the size of what he had lost. And outside the palace, in the eastern houses and the northern trade networks and the diplomatic channels that ran underneath the visible surface of continental politics, a rumor was already beginning to travel, the kind of rumor that starts in a single fact and expands into implication with the efficiency of water finding its level. The Luna of the Ashthorn Empire had left, and she had not gone quietly into obscurity. She had gone straight to the most strategically positioned rival kingdom on the continent, and she had not gone as a refugee. She had gone as an asset. In the Moon Palace, in his private study, Ryker Ashthorn held the letter with both hands and felt the first cold edge of a fear he had never thought he'd have cause to feel. Not the fear of losing, the fear of losing to her. And outside, in the world, Seraphina Vale was already beginning to reshape with the specific competence of a woman who had been practicing invisibly for 4 years. The real game was only now beginning. 3 weeks into her tenure in the Crimson Dominion, Seraphina received a visitor. She was in her new office, a room she had chosen herself, which was already a different experience from anything she'd had in the Moon Palace, where the spaces she occupied were assigned and the spaces she wished to occupy were navigated by careful politics. This room faced east. It had tall windows and a view of the valley where the Dominion's primary trade roads converged, which meant that sitting at her desk she could see, in literal terms, the economic traffic of the kingdom she was beginning to understand. She had requested the room specifically for this reason. Darius had agreed without asking her to justify the request, which she was still, weeks later, occasionally startled by. The visitor was Councillor Mare, the Ashthorn Empire's senior diplomatic envoy, who had served 3 administrations and knew her from the years she had navigated beside him in council chambers he had never quite fully acknowledged her presence in. He sat across her desk with the expression of a man who has been sent to do something he doesn't entirely believe in and is too professional to let that show fully. "The king," he said, "extends his regards. Tell the king his regards are noted. He'd like to—" Mare paused, tried again. "There is a feeling in the palace that the current situation might be resolved with some goodwill on both sides." Seraphina looked at him steadily. "What's he offering?" "Full restoration. Your title, your chambers, your position on the council." "My position?" She let the word sit for a moment. "Which position is that exactly? The one I actually occupied with the access and the influence and the institutional role I performed for 4 years? Or the Luna's position, the one that gets named in formal announcements and seated at the high table and publicly acknowledged at ceremonial dances?" Marit was quiet. "Because those are 2 very different positions," she said. "I held both for a while, and then one of them was taken away incrementally until what remained was the title with none of the actual architecture." She paused. "I'm not interested in the title. He wants you home. I know he does." And she did know it. She knew Ryker, knew the specific shape of his wanting, the way it was real and genuine and deeply inconvenient because it was real and genuine and had never been quite enough. "That's not the same as wanting what he had when I was there. He wants the feeling of my presence. He doesn't want the reality of what I need in order to be present." Marit looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his face something she had not seen there in 3 years. Respect. Not the performed respect of a court official managing his Luna. Actual respect. The kind that comes from watching someone make a decision correctly. "The Eastern trade families," he said, "have begun redirecting their correspondence." "I know." "The Thornfield provinces are requesting a direct meeting with the Dominions." "I know, Counselor." He stopped, nodded, slowly, with the nod of a man accepting a reality he hadn't fully seen the shape of until this moment. "The summit," he said. "You're still attending." "I have an official role in the Dominion delegation." She looked at him with clear, uncomplicated eyes. I'll be at every session. Something moved across Maret's face that was not quite the specific expression of a man who has just understood something catastrophic, but was adjacent to it. Is there anything, he said, choosing his words with the precision of a man who knows that in this room, precision is the minimum required. That would— No, she said. Simple. Complete. Maret stood, gathered his documents with the careful movements of a man managing the dignity of an unsuccessful mission. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not the diplomat anymore. That was just the old man who had watched her navigate an impossible position for 4 years. You deserved better than what you were given. Seraphina Vale looked at the eastern windows, at the trade roads converging in the valley below, at the clean, unencumbered view of a future she was building with her own name on it. Yes, she said. I did. Maret left. She turned back to her correspondence. Outside her window, a courier was riding in from the eastern road, carrying a packet of documents she had been expecting. The preliminary trade agreements from the Thornfield provinces, the formal opening moves of a political realignment that would take 6 months to complete but had been 3 years in the making, built from every conversation she'd had and every relationship she'd maintained and every piece of institutional knowledge that Ryker's empire hadn't realized it was risking when it decided she was furniture. She reached for the packet. And in the Moon Palace, 12 days' ride to the west, preparations were beginning for the sovereign summit that she would be attending. Not as a Luna who had been publicly, permanently, officially replaced. Not as a woman reclaiming what was taken, but as the chief strategic advisor of the most aggressively expanding empire on the continent, with resources and mandate, and a king who had asked her what she wanted and had been willing to give her the infrastructure to build it. The summit would begin in 4 weeks. She had 4 weeks to finish what she was building. She worked. And somewhere in the Eastern Valley, moving faster than formal diplomatic channels typically moved, a message was already traveling toward the Thornfield noble houses, not from her, not in her name, but from a source they trusted, carrying information that would, when it arrived, begin the sequence of events that would reshape the entire eastern corridor of the continent's political map. The message was simple. It said, "She's ready. Are you?" And in the silence after that message arrived, in the various receiving rooms and private offices of the houses that had spent 3 years watching the Luna of the Ashthorn Empire be quietly erased, answers began to come back. Yes. Yes, yes, and yes. The answers kept coming. Seraphina had not sent the message herself. That was the point, and the precision of it. What she had built over 4 years in the Ashthorn court was not a network of debts or leverage or transactional obligations. It was something harder to name and considerably more durable, a web of relationships between people who had observed her work and trusted its quality, and who had, over time, transferred a portion of that trust to her judgment. When her judgment said move, they moved. Not because she commanded it, because they had watched her be right too many times to dismiss the signal. By the end of the first week, 7 Eastern House representatives had sent formal inquiries to the Crimson Dominion's trade offices. By the end of the second week, 2 of the Thornfield province's primary grain export contracts had been quietly renegotiated through Dominion-affiliated brokers. By the end of the third week, the Ashthorn Empire's eastern revenue projections were showing a deviation that the palace treasury couldn't yet explain and couldn't yet trace. Seraphina could have explained it. She had in fact designed it, not as sabotage, which would have required her to care about Ryker's empire in a destructive way she had long since moved past, but as the natural consequence of removing herself from a system that had depended on her and had simply not known that it did. She wasn't tearing anything down. She was just no longer holding it up. There is a particular kind of power that lives in maintenance, in the daily, invisible, uncredited work of keeping complex systems functional. It is the least glamorous form of power and the most consequential, because its presence is never acknowledged and its absence is catastrophic. Ryker had been surrounded by this kind of power for 4 years without understanding that it had a source. He had experienced it as the ambient competence of a well-run empire. The way people experience clean water as the ambient quality of a good city without thinking about the infrastructure that produces it. He was beginning to think about the infrastructure now. Darius found her at 6 in the morning, which was when she was typically already working, because the hours between 5 and 8 were when the best thinking happened, before the day's demands colonized the mind's available space, while the problems were still clean and the options were still multiple. He came in without knocking, which she had told him was acceptable in work hours, and set a document on her desk with the deliberate placement of a man delivering something significant. "From the palace," he said. She looked at it, recognized the seal. "He sent another envoy?" "Not an envoy." Darius pulled the chair across from her desk and sat with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over weeks of working in close proximity, the particular ease of two people who have discovered that they think in compatible rhythms without having planned for it. "A personal letter, addressed directly to you, not through diplomatic channels. My staff intercepted it at the border and brought it to me first, per protocol. You can read it, or I can have it destroyed. Your call." She looked at the seal for a moment, at the handwriting of her name on the outside, which she recognized as Ryker's actual handwriting, not a secretary's. "I'll read it," she said. Darius said nothing. He picked up the trade document he'd been working through and gave her the private space of his deliberate inattention, which was its own form of courtesy. She broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages. She read it in 3 minutes. Then she set it down and looked at the eastern windows and breathed for a moment. "Well," she said. "Bad?" "No." She thought about how to characterize it accurately. "Honest, which is almost worse." Darius looked up. "He says he understands now." She looked at the letter without touching it again. "He uses that exact phrase, 'I understand now.' And then he lists the things he understands. That he made her invisible, that he mistook staying for being unable to leave, that he called her what he needed when he should have asked what she needed." She paused. "It's accurate. It's a genuine accounting. He did the work of actually looking at what happened. But understanding what you did wrong and being someone different are 2 separate things. Understanding is the beginning of a process. He's describing the beginning and presenting it as the destination." Darius set down his document. "What do you want to do with it?" She picked up the letter, folded it precisely along its original creases, and set it in the left drawer of her desk. Not the waste bin, not the fire. The drawer where she kept things that were true but not actionable. "Nothing," she said. "I want to do nothing with it. I want to go back to the Thornfield grain contracts and figure out why the 3rd clause is creating a bottleneck in the distribution timing." He picked up his document. "3rd clause is a legacy provision from the pre-consolidation agreements. The original drafters built in a seasonal adjustment mechanism that made sense in the agricultural context of 200 years ago and creates a bureaucratic delay in the current logistics framework. Can we draft around it without voiding the original agreement?" "Possibly. I'll have Callan look at it this afternoon." "Tell Callan to look at it this morning. The summit is in 3 weeks and I want this resolved before we walk into those sessions." "This morning," Darius agreed. They worked. Baltaus. The summit preparation sessions in the Crimson Dominion had a different quality than anything Seraphina had experienced in the Ashthorn court. Not better, necessarily. Different in ways that revealed, by contrast, things about the Ashthorn court she had not fully articulated even to herself. Ryker ran his counsels on the implicit understanding that his judgment was the ceiling. You could present information, analysis, alternatives. The decision was his, and the decision was always, in some fundamental sense, already made before the session began. The council was the performance of deliberation rather than deliberation itself. It was efficient in one sense and brittle in another, because it produced decisions that were only ever as good as Ryker's judgment on that particular day and that particular condition, and it produced advisors who learned over time to manage their input within the acceptable range rather than push against the ceiling. Darius ran his councils differently. He ran them like a man who genuinely believed that the best outcome was more likely to emerge from real friction than from managed consensus. He argued. He invited argument. He pushed back on his own positions out loud, which made the people around him do the same, and what emerged from that friction was harder and more reliable than anything that came from a room designed to produce agreement. Seraphina had been in his war council twice in the past week. Both times she had said things she would not have been able to say in the Ashthorn council chamber, not because Ryker would have punished her, but because the room itself would have absorbed the challenge and routed around it, the way water routes around an obstacle without actually removing it. In Darius's counsel, when she pushed, something pushed back. It was, she was discovering, the thing she had been missing without knowing she was missing it. The name for it was being taken seriously. 3 days before the summit, a rider arrived from the east with news that changed the shape of everything. Seraphina was in the war room with Darius and 3 of his senior military advisors when the messenger was brought in. Young, road-worn, carrying a sealed document in the interior pocket of his coat with the careful protectiveness of someone who understands that what they're carrying matters. He handed it directly to Seraphina, which told her who had sent it before she opened it. She read it. Her face did not change. "Give us the room," Darius said to his advisors. They filed out with the disciplined efficiency of people who understood that give us the room was not a request. When they were gone, "What is it?" She set the document on the table between them. "Lord Cavan Torish has made a decision." Darius looked at the document. Lord Cavan Torish was the head of the Torish House, which controlled approximately 40% of the Ashthorn Empire's northern mining operations, which in turn supplied the raw materials for roughly a third of the Empire's military manufacturing. He was also, as Darius knew from the extensive briefings she had prepared over the past weeks, a man who had watched Seraphina manage the northern trade infrastructure for 4 years, with the particular attention of someone who understood that she was the reason it functioned and had wondered, privately, what would happen if she were no longer there to manage it. Now he knew. "He wants to restructure," she said, "the northern mining contracts. He wants to move them through Dominion-affiliated brokers rather than the Imperial Exchange." Darius was quiet for a moment. The weight of what this meant was sitting in the room between them like a physical object. "If Torish moves," he said, "the northern houses follow. Most of them. Seraphina." He looked at her with that direct gray gaze. "This is not a trade negotiation anymore." "No," she agreed, "it isn't. This is the beginning of something that cannot be undone. If we accept Torish's restructuring proposal, we are actively participating in the fracturing of the Ashthorn Empire's economic foundation. That is an act of strategic warfare dressed in commercial language. I know what it is. And you want to proceed." She looked at the document, at Lord Torish's careful, formal language wrapping a decision that would, if followed through, begin a chain of events that would take 3 years to complete and would, at the end of those 3 years, leave the Ashthorn Empire substantially diminished and the Crimson Dominion substantially ascendant. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. She thought about what it would mean to say no. And she thought, because she was honest with herself in a way that she had not always been, in the years when honesty about her own motivations felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, about whether what she was feeling was strategy or revenge, and whether there was a meaningful difference, and whether it mattered. What she arrived at was this: the difference mattered, and the honest answer was that it was both, and that the both of it didn't make the strategic assessment wrong. Torish was going to move regardless. The question was whether the Dominion caught what was moving or let it fall to some less organized power. What she was bringing to this decision was not only her anger at what had been done to her. It was 4 years of institutional knowledge about how the Ashthorn Empire's economic infrastructure worked, who held what, where the real dependencies lived. That knowledge was legitimate. That knowledge was hers. She had built it. She was entitled to use it. "Accept the proposal," she said. "Draft the terms carefully. Nothing that violates the existing diplomatic conventions. I don't want to give Ryker a legal pretext to call this an act of aggression, but accept the restructuring and begin the process." Darius looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Cullen will have draft terms by tonight," he said. She nodded, picked up the document, set it in the folder she was taking to the summit. The Sovereign Summit convened in the neutral territory of the Greymere Accord Hall, a building constructed specifically for the purpose of hosting gatherings of powers who did not trust each other enough to meet on either's home ground. It was large, cold, deliberately uncomfortable in the specific way of spaces designed by committee to belong to no one, with high stone ceilings and narrow windows, and the permanent smell of old wood and recent cleaning. She arrived with the Dominion delegation. She had thought, in the weeks between the decision and this moment, about what it would feel like to walk into the same space as Ryker again. She had examined the thought from several angles, looking for the version of herself that was still hoping for something she refused to name. The version that had not fully made the turn yet, that was still facing the old direction even while the body moved toward the new one. She didn't find that version. What she found instead was the clean, uncomplicated clarity of someone who has resolved a question so thoroughly that the question itself has stopped generating noise. She was wearing Dominion colors, not Ashthorn silver. The deep gray blue of the Crimson Dominion's formal court colors, with the chief advisor's insignia at her collar, the one Darius had designed specifically for this role because the role had not existed before her and required its own visual language. She looked exactly like what she was. The hall was already half full when the Dominion delegation entered. She saw the recalibration move across the room in the specific way that significant information moves through a space full of politically acute people. Not as a wave, but as a spreading pattern of small adjustments, a reorientation of eyes and shoulders and conversational directions toward the point of new significance. She saw Evelise first. Lady Evelise Crestfall, standing at Ryker's left side in the Ashthorn delegation's designated area, dressed in silver that was a precise shade lighter than the Luna's silver Seraphina had worn for 4 years. The silver of ambition positioned just below the ceiling, careful not to touch it until the touch was official. She was beautiful and controlled and reading the room with the rapid precision of someone who has learned that rooms like this one determine futures. Their eyes met. Evelise's expression did not change. She was too skilled for that. But something shifted in her posture. The fractional reconfiguration of a person encountering a threat they had assessed as resolved and are now reassessing. Good, Seraphina thought, without malice. Accurate information is always good. Then she saw Ryker. He was standing with his back partially toward the entrance, speaking with the Thornfield delegation's head. And she had a moment, a clean, clear moment, to look at him without being observed looking, which was the most honest way to look at anyone. He was tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper than she remembered, which was 3 months of compounding difficulty wearing through the surface. His jaw had its governing tension, but there was something beneath that tension that was newer. Not the tension of command, but the tension of someone managing an anxiety they haven't identified yet, haven't named, only feel as a persistent pressure at the back of the skull. He felt the shift in the room. He turned, and their eyes met across the gray mirror accord hall, and the thing that happened in that moment was not what either of them might have predicted. It was not the heat of anger or the weight of grief or the complicated architecture of 4 years of love and erosion and leaving. It was something simpler and more final than any of those. Recognition. She saw him see her. Not the Luna, not the woman he had believed would always stay. Her. The specific person she had become in the space his choices had created. The chief advisor of a rival empire standing in her own authority in the room he had expected to walk into first. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was necessary. Then she turned to the Dominion's lead diplomatic officer and continued the conversation she had been having. The first session dealt with territorial border adjustments in the southeastern corridor, nominally the summit's primary agenda item, the one that had been the official justification for convening. Seraphina sat at the secondary Dominion table, where advisors and senior staff were positioned, and she worked through it with the efficient attention of someone for whom this level of complexity was unremarkable. She watched Ryker's team struggle, not visibly, not in ways that could be named or addressed in the session, but she knew the Ashthorn Empire's institutional knowledge better than anyone in that room except the people who had been living inside its deterioration for 3 months. And she could see, in the gaps in their prepared positions, in the moments where the lead negotiator reached for a detail that should have been in his briefing and wasn't, the specific shape of what was missing. She had been the person who built those briefings. At the mid-session break, she stepped into the corridor for water and found Ryker already there. He had positioned himself at the far end, which meant he had come deliberately, which meant this was a choice. She walked toward the water service and poured a glass and did not manufacture a reason to leave. "You look well," he said. "I am well." She drank, set the glass down. "Your southeastern position has a gap in the historical precedent documentation." The Haveth Accords of 70 years ago established a corridor exception that your current argument is implicitly relying on but hasn't explicitly cited. Your opponents will find it by the third session. Silence. Why are you telling me that? He said. Yes, because it's true, and it costs me nothing to say it. She looked at him directly. I'm not here to watch you fail, Ryker. I'm not here for any reason that has to do with you. I'm here because I have a job. He looked at her with those eyes that had been the whole world to her once, and she looked back with the specific steadiness of someone who has been through the fire and out the other side and found that what remains, after everything burns, is a version of yourself you can actually live inside. I read your letter, he said, the one you left. I assumed. I've read it a lot. He looked at the floor, then back at her. Every part of it is right. The accounting I did of what happened, every part of it is right. I know that. I know you know it. Then why, Ryker? Her voice was not unkind. It was the opposite of unkind, in fact. It was the kind of patient, clear address you give someone you have genuinely cared about and do not wish to harm, but also cannot make your responsibility anymore. Understanding what you did isn't the same as being someone who wouldn't do it again. And I don't know which one you are. I'm not sure you know either, and that uncertainty is not something I'm willing to build a life around. Not again. He was quiet. The weight of it sat between them. I miss you, he said. Raw, simple. Not the Alpha King, just the man underneath. I know you do. She picked up her folder. That's real. I believe it completely. But missing someone and having been what they needed are different things, and one of them doesn't fix the other. She walked back toward the session room. Behind her, she heard him breathe. A single, compressed breath, the kind that holds a lot. She did not turn around. The second session was where the real summit happened, not the formal negotiation that was still grinding through its territorial procedure. The real summit was the network of private conversations, corridor encounters, and quietly rearranged dinner seating that constituted the actual decision-making of gatherings like this one. The formal sessions provided the language for decisions that had already been made in the spaces between. Seraphina worked those spaces with the efficiency of someone who had been studying them for years. Lord Torish arrived mid-afternoon and found her in the Eastern Reading Room, which she had begun using as an unofficial office because it was adjacent to the room where the Dominion delegation's private sessions were held and offered an unobtrusive secondary access point. He was a large man, Torish, with a northern bluntness that had always been comfortable in her presence because she had never required him to soften it. It's moving, he said, by way of greeting. I assumed it would be. How many have confirmed? 11 houses as of this morning. 3 more are waiting to see how the summit positions shake out. He sat without waiting for an invitation, which she appreciated. The palace has noticed the revenue deviation. They've sent auditors to the Eastern Exchange. Good. He looked at her steadily. You understand that when this is done, there is no repair available. The Ashthorn Empire will never trust the northern houses again, and the northern houses will have made a choice they cannot walk back from. I understand that. And you're sure? She met his eyes. Torish was not a man who asked questions he didn't need the answer to. He was asking because he was making his own assessment, running his own calculation, and her answer was one of the inputs. I'm sure, she said, not because I want to damage the Empire, because the realignment makes structural sense for everyone involved, and the only thing that was preventing it from happening was the belief that the current configuration was stable. It isn't stable. It hasn't been stable for 2 years. I was one of the things making it look stable. Torish nodded slowly. Then I'll confirm the remaining 3. Wait until after the summit's third session, she said. Let the position plays resolve first. I don't want the timing to look coordinated. It is coordinated. Yes. But it doesn't need to look it. She paused. There's a difference between doing something and making it look like you planned it. One is power. The other is provocation. We're doing power. He almost smiled, which for Torish was the equivalent of anyone else's genuine laugh. You've changed. I've had 3 months to be myself without managing around everyone else's comfort, she said. This is who I was the whole time. The 4th night of the summit, Evelise Cressfall requested a private meeting. Seraphina accepted. Not because she owed it, but because she was curious. The particular clean curiosity of a person who has no fear remaining in a given situation and can therefore afford to be genuinely interested in what they find there. They met in the smaller of the Accord Hall's reception rooms, without attendants, without the usual diplomatic architecture of witnesses and formal framings. Just two women in a room, which was, stripped of every layer of court overlay, exactly what this had always been. Evelisa came in the way she did everything. Controlled, precise, reading the room before committing to her position within it. She sat across the small table, and she looked at Seraphina with eyes that were doing a great deal of work behind their surface composure. "I'm not here to apologize," she said. Straight, no preamble. "I didn't expect you to be. What happened between you and Ryker was between you and Ryker. I didn't break anything that wasn't already cracking." "That's an accurate assessment," Seraphina said. "And it's also the argument that people make when they want to absolve themselves of participating in something without examining whether they could have chosen not to." A beat. "You're not wrong," Evelisa said carefully. "I know. I want to know what you're building. Direct. No decoration." Evelise, whatever else she was not a woman who wasted time with indirection when she had an actual question. "Not strategically, not for the summit. I want to know what you're actually building, because the people who are moving toward you, and I want to understand why." Seraphina looked at her for a long moment, at the calculated composure, and beneath it, the actual question, which was the question of a woman who has been climbing toward a thing and is beginning to wonder whether the thing she's reaching for is the thing worth reaching for. "I'm building a position from which I can do the work I'm capable of," she said. "That's all. I'm not building a monument to what was done to me. I'm not building a weapon aimed at anyone specifically. I found a place where what I know has value and where the person I work with treats that value as the basis of our relationship rather than a tool he manages." She paused. "That's an uncomplicated thing, actually. Most people can't find it. That's not their fault. It's genuinely rare." Evelise was quiet. Something moved in her face that was not composure. "He needs you," she said finally. Not the way you think I mean that. I'm not here to bring you back. I'm saying the Empire is in actual difficulty, real difficulty. And it's the kind that doesn't respond to any of the tools he knows how to use, because the gap isn't in his military capacity or his diplomatic relationships. The gap is in the institutional knowledge that kept the underlying architecture functional. She looked at her hands. "I can't fill it. I know my own limits. I can manage court. I can manage relationships. I can manage the surface of things. What you were doing wasn't the surface." "No," Seraphina said. "It wasn't. Is there any version of this where you help him?" It was almost not a question. It was the shape of a question asked by someone who already knows the answer but needs to hear it confirmed. Seraphina thought about the letter in her desk drawer, the accurate accounting, the understanding that had arrived too late. "No," she said. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the clean simplicity of a true statement. "There isn't. Not because I want his empire to fail, but because the only version of me that could go back is the version that made herself invisible to be useful to him, and that version doesn't exist anymore, and I wouldn't return her to existence even if I could." Evelise nodded. She stood. At the door, she paused, and what she said next was the most honest thing she had said in possibly years, which Seraphina recognized because honesty has a specific quality that performance doesn't, a roughness at the edge where the polish breaks down. "I think," Evelise said, "I made a mistake." "In what sense?" "In the sense that I wanted what you had without understanding what it cost you to have it. And now I'm standing where you were standing, and I can feel the shape of it, and it's—" She stopped. "It's different than I thought." Seraphina looked at her steadily, at the woman who had occupied the space her removal had created, and who was discovering in real time that the space itself had teeth. "Yes," she said. "It is." Evelise left. Seraphina sat for a long moment in the empty room, with the silence that remains after an honest conversation. The particular, rare silence of two people who have said something true to each other across a difficult distance. Then she picked up her folder and went back to work. The summit's fifth and final day opened with a session Seraphina had been preparing for since before she left the Ashthorn Empire. The formal trade restructuring proposals. She had drafted the Dominion's position herself. 30 pages of meticulous, legally unimpeachable documentation that proposed, in the careful language of commercial diplomacy, a systematic realignment of the eastern and northern trade corridors that would, if adopted, redirect approximately 40% of the Ashthorn Empire's external revenue flows through Dominion-affiliated infrastructure over the next 5 years. It was not technically an attack. Every clause was defensible. Every proposal had legal precedent and commercial justification. It was structured so that the assembled powers of the summit could read it as rational market reorganization rather than strategic warfare. The Ashthorn delegation received it at 7 in the morning. By 8, Ryker had called for an emergency pre-session meeting with his senior advisors. By 9, the Ashthorn senior advisor, a man named Fenn, who had been doing this work for 20 years and was very good at it, appeared in the corridor where Seraphina was reviewing the final document. He stood in front of her. She looked up. "This is yours," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of professional recognition. Every clause structure, the precedent citations, the commercial framing. He looked at the document in her hands. 30 pages in the language of the Imperial Archive. "I know your handwriting when I see it, even in drafting." "The document is the Dominion's official position," she said. "Yes." He looked at her with the expression of someone who has served a long time and has the specific exhaustion of a man watching something large and inevitable arrive. "Can it be negotiated?" "Portions of it." "Which portions?" She looked at him. At the 20-year career behind his eyes, the specific weight of a man who has been loyal to an institution and is now watching the institution's foundation shift beneath him. "The timeline," she said. "The 5-year acceleration in the northern corridor can be adjusted. The eastern restructuring. No, that's already in motion." He absorbed this. "How far in motion?" he said. She held his gaze and let him see the answer in it without saying it, because some things are clearer unspoken. Ben closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment, then opened them with the weary steadiness of a professional. "I'll tell the king," he said. "Tell him also," she said, "that the document proposes a joint advisory commission to oversee the transition. It's in the last section. It's a genuine offer. The Dominion has an interest in stability, not chaos." Fenn looked at her. "That's more than he deserves," he said quietly. "It's what's strategically sound," she said. "Those are the same thing, sometimes." He left. She stood in the corridor and breathed and felt the weight of the moment settling around her. The specific weight of a decision that has fully become real, that has passed the point where reversing it would be smaller than the cost of following it through. She had known, when she walked out of the Moon Palace 3 months ago, that this was coming. Not the specific shape of it, that had emerged from the actual conditions on the ground, from Torish and the Eastern houses and Darius's trust and the accumulation of choices made by free actors in a fluid situation. But the direction of it, the general destination, she had known. She had walked toward it anyway, because the alternative was walking back. And walking back was the one option that was genuinely not available. Not because the door was locked, but because the version of herself who could walk back through it was already, irreversibly, someone she was no longer. The 5th session began. She took her seat at the Dominion table. Across the room, Ryker settled into the Ashthorn position. He looked at the document in front of him, 30 pages in the careful language of commercial diplomacy, and she saw the moment when he stopped seeing it as a trade proposal and understood it for what it was. Not a weapon. An answer. The answer to 4 years of "you know, you're the one I truly need," given in the only language large enough to contain it. He looked up. Their eyes met across the Greymere Accord Hall for the second time in 5 days. And what moved between them in that look was not anger, and not love, and not triumph. It was recognition again, but different than before, deeper. He recognized she could see it, finally, fully, without the buffer of hope or denial, the size of what he had lost. Not the woman, not even the Luna. The specific mind and will and capacity of a person who had chosen him and his empire for 4 years and was now choosing something else, and was thriving in that choosing, and was going to keep thriving, and was never, under any version of any future he could offer, going to stop. The session moderator called the room to order. Seraphina opened the document, and in the silence before the formal proceedings resumed, in the held breath of a room full of powerful people who understood that something decisive was being finalized, she felt cleanly and completely and without ambivalence that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she had been placed, where she had chosen. And then the session began, and the session was the beginning of the end of one empire and the beginning of something she was still building, something that didn't have a name yet, that was still taking its shape from the decisions being made in this room and the rooms that would follow and the years of work that would follow those. She was ready for all of it. She turned the first page. Across the room, Ryker Ashthorn did the same. And in the space between those two pages, in the air between the man who had held everything and lost it, and the woman who had been made invisible and refused to disappear, the future arrived. Not as a revelation, as a document. 30 pages in precise and legally unimpeachable language that said, "I was never gone. I was always this." And now the whole world is going to know it. What Ryker read on page 23 stopped him cold. Not the commercial clause, not the legal precedent. The name. A name she had buried in the commission proposal, the joint advisory structure she had described to Fenn as a genuine offer, which it was, but which was also something else, something that only Ryker would recognize, because it was the name of a house that had been private between them, the name of a place they had talked about once, early, when they were still the kind of people who talked about places they would build someday. She had named the commission after it. And in the margin next to his own handwritten note, he had been annotating as he read, which was his habit, which she had always known was his habit. His pen had stopped. She knew this because she could see him from across the room. She knew this because she had put the name there deliberately, not as cruelty, not as sentiment, as the clearest possible statement of what had been possible and what he had done with it. This was always in me. I would have built this with you. You chose something else. And so now I build it without you, and I name the architecture after what we could have been, so that you understand precisely what you gave up. Ryker set down his pen. He stared at the page, and the summit continued around him, the machinery of continental politics grinding forward through its formal procedures, and outside the narrow windows the autumn light moved across the Graymere Valley, and somewhere in the structure of the document in front of him, a woman he had believed would always stay was telling him, with perfect clarity and zero malice, exactly how large the thing he had traded away actually was. He did not look up again. Not for a long time. And when the session broke for the midday interval and the delegations filed out into the corridors, the Ashthorn Empire's intelligence officer appeared at the door of the reading room where Seraphina was working through afternoon documentation, and he set a folded paper on the table beside her and left without speaking. She opened it. It was not a letter. It was a single line in Ryker's handwriting. The commission name. Did you know, when you left, that it would come to this? She looked at the question for a moment, at the handwriting, at the specific shape of what he was actually asking. Not about strategy, not about the trade restructuring, but about whether she had walked out of the Moon Palace 3 months ago already knowing the full size of what she was capable of, or whether she had discovered it in the space his choices had created. She picked up her pen. She wrote a single word beneath his question. Yes. She folded the paper. She set it at the edge of the table for the next person who passed to return. And outside in the corridor, she heard his delegation preparing for the afternoon session, the shuffle of documents, the low consultation of advisors, the particular sound of an institution reconfiguring around a truth it had not been ready to face. The afternoon session was going to reshape the next decade of continental politics. She was ready. What she was not ready for, what no calculation she had run, no strategic model she had built, no preparation she had made in 3 months of deliberate construction had accounted for, was the rider that arrived at the Accord Hall at 3 in the afternoon bearing a sealed document from the Ashthorn Empire's Northern Border Command. The seal was military. The document was addressed to her. Not to the Dominion, not to Darius, not to the summit's formal diplomatic channels. To her, by name, with her Dominion title. Her hands were steady when she opened it. They were always steady. But what was inside made the world go very quiet. The seal was from the Northern Border Command, not from a general, not from a diplomatic attaché or trade liaison or any of the usual channels through which information moved between the Ashthorn Empire and the outside world. From the Border Command directly, The military installation that controlled the passes through the Grey Vale Mountains, the ones that connected the Empire's northern interior to the eastern territories where Seraphina had spent 3 months building something that mattered. She read it once, then she read it again, because the first reading had produced an understanding she wanted to verify was accurate before she acted on it. It was accurate. The document stated, in the clipped and precise language of military reporting, that 3 days prior, Crimson Dominion forces had moved into position at the Kale Pass, not in force, not in a configuration that constituted invasion, but in the specific, careful arrangement of troops that military professionals recognize as pre-positioning, the kind of movement that happens before something else happens, the kind of movement that requires either a very good explanation or a significant problem. The document further stated that the Border Command had intercepted communications between the Dominion's eastern garrison and an unspecified second party, the contents of which suggested coordination of some kind regarding the Thornfield provinces, specifically regarding the 3 northern houses that had not yet formally committed to the trade restructuring, the ones Seraphina had told Torish to wait on. The final section stated the source of the document. The source was a name she knew, a name she had 3 months ago trusted with the preliminary outlines of the Eastern restructuring strategy. Not the full architecture, but enough of the shape to be actionable by someone with the right contacts and the motivation to use it. The name was Kalen, Darius's senior legal advisor, the man who had been in every strategy session, every drafting meeting, every conversation where the Dominion's approach to the summit had been worked out in granular detail. The man Darius had told to look at the Thornfield grain contracts this morning. Kalen, who had contacts in the Ashthorn military command that Seraphina had not known about. Colin, who had apparently decided that the information moving through Seraphina's strategy sessions was valuable enough to sell in 2 directions simultaneously. She set the document down. She sat very still for a moment in the way she sat when her mind was moving faster than her body, and her body had learned to get out of the way. The troop pre-positioning at Kale Pass was not Darius. She was certain of this in the way she was certain of structural facts, not from feeling but from the architecture of what she knew about him, which was extensive and had never produced evidence of this kind of gap between what he said and what he did. Darius was many things. He was not a man who positioned troops without telling his chief strategic advisor. It violated the operational logic of everything they had built together, which meant one of 2 things. Either Darius didn't know, or someone had moved without his authorization, using his infrastructure, which was a different and considerably more serious problem. She picked up the document and walked to the door. No. She found him in the Dominion's private session room, reviewing the afternoon agenda with 2 of his military advisors. He looked up when she came in. He read her face in the way he had learned to read it over 3 months of working in close proximity. The specific configuration of her composure that meant something significant was happening beneath the surface. "Out," he said to the advisors. They left. She set the document on the table in front of him and stepped back and watched him read it. She watched his face. What she saw there was not guilt. She knew what guilt looked like on the faces of people managing it. She had spent 4 years in a court full of people managing it. What she saw was something different. The rapid, sequential processing of information that lands wrong, that doesn't fit the model, that produces a controlled urgency in the eyes of a man who is realigning his understanding of a situation very quickly. He looked up. "Callan," he said. "Yes." "I didn't know." "I believe you." He looked at the document again, turned to the section about the troop pre-positioning. His jaw set in the way it set when he was managing something that made him angry while refusing to let the anger make decisions ahead of him. "The Kyle Pass movement was not authorized by me. I know. Which means someone in your command structure authorized it independently, or was directed to authorize it by someone they believed had the authority. And the only person in your command structure with both the access and the Ashthorn connections to make that sequence work is Kalen." Darius set the document down. He looked at the wall. "How long has he been running 2 channels?" "I don't know. Long enough to have established contact with the Border Command before the summit, which means at minimum before we arrived here." The implications of that sat in the room between them. If Callan had been running dual channels before the summit, then some portion of everything Seraphina had built with Darius's team over 3 months, had been visible to parties she hadn't authorized to see it. The question was how much. The question was what had been done with it. The question was whether the trade restructuring she had spent 3 months constructing was still the structure she believed it to be, or whether it had been quietly, selectively hollowed out by information moving in directions she hadn't controlled. "I need to talk to him," she said. "I'll have him brought here." "Alone," she said. "Just me and him." Darius looked at her. "Seraphina, I know him better than you do at this point. I've spent 3 months working with him daily. I know how he constructs his justifications. I know where the pressure points are." She met his eyes. "Give me 20 minutes. A pause. 20 minutes, he said. Cullen was 43, with the precise organizational mind of a man who had built his career on knowing more than the people around him and deploying that knowledge with surgical care. He had been, genuinely, one of the most useful people Seraphina had worked with in her 3 months at the Dominion. She had trusted the quality of his work, even when she had not particularly warmed to the quality of his character, which was a distinction she had always been capable of making. She had apparently been making it about the wrong thing. He came into the room and sat and looked at the document on the table, and then looked at her. And his face did the thing that faces do when people who have been managing a concealment understand that the concealment has ended. Not panic. The specific stillness of someone running calculations. "How long?" she said. He looked at his hands. "Before you came." "From the beginning." "From the beginning," he confirmed. She absorbed this. From the beginning meant before she had arrived. Before she had built anything, which meant his arrangement with the Ashthorn Border Command predated her involvement entirely, which meant the dual channel was not a response to what she was building. It was an existing structure that she had walked into without knowing it. "You were already positioned," she said, "before I arrived. The Dominion's eastern expansion has interested multiple parties for some time. I was a point of information exchange. It was never intended to be..." He stopped. "To be what?" "Consequential." He met her eyes for the first time. "When you came, what you were building, the scale of it, it became consequential. And by the time I understood that, I had commitments I couldn't easily exit." There is a particular kind of anger that does not produce heat. It produces the opposite. A cold clarification, the way dropping temperature makes water hard, that takes something fluid and gives it edges. Seraphina felt this kind of anger moving through her now, and she let it move because suppressing it would cost energy she needed for thinking. "The troop pre-positioning," she said. "Whose idea?" "The Border Command's. They were responding to the trade restructuring proposal. When the document went out this morning, someone in the Ashthorn Command who had seen my earlier communications decided to move preemptively, to demonstrate capacity." He looked at his hands again. "I didn't authorize it. I didn't know it was happening. But your information made it possible." He said nothing, which was its own answer. This is what betrayal actually looks like, stripped of the drama that popular imagination assigns to it. It rarely arrives as a deliberate act of destruction. It rarely comes from a person who woke up one morning and decided to cause maximum damage. More often, almost always, it comes from someone who made a series of small accommodations to competing interests, each one individually justifiable, until the accumulation of those accommodations created something that operates exactly like deliberate destruction while allowing the person responsible to maintain, with genuine sincerity, that they never intended it. Cullen had not intended to sabotage Seraphina's work. He had intended to serve his own position, which required maintaining relationships on multiple sides of a realigning situation, which required sharing enough information to keep those relationships viable, which had produced, as a side effect he had genuinely not fully anticipated, the exposure of a strategy that was now compromised in ways she was still calculating. This is the specific genius of self-serving behavior. It doesn't need malice to cause catastrophe. It only needs the human capacity to not fully reckon with where small choices lead. "Get out," she said. He looked up. "Leave the room," she said. "Leave the building. I'll deal with what comes next. But I cannot look at you right now without making decisions I don't have time for." He stood. He left. She sat alone in the room with the document and the afternoon light coming through the narrow windows and the full weight of a situation she had not anticipated pressing down on everything she had built. What the troop movement at Kale Pass actually changed. What Seraphina spent the next 40 minutes working through with the cold precision of a mind that had been trained on 4 years of complex political management was the optics. The substance of the trade restructuring was still sound. The Eastern House commitments were real. Torish was solid. The legal architecture of the Dominion's position was unimpeachable. What the troop movement had done was create a narrative. In the morning, the Dominion's trade proposal had been aggressive commercial repositioning dressed in legal language. By this afternoon, with Ashthorn military intelligence circulating reports of border prepositioning, it would be read as something else, something with military intent, something that the assembled summit powers, who had been watching the Dominion's expansion with the cautious attention of powers who understood that what grows aggressively in one direction eventually turns toward others, would be inclined to respond to differently. 3 years of careful legal architecture could be reframed by one day of unauthorized troop movement as the commercial mask on a military strategy. And in the court of continental opinion, reframing was often faster than correction. She went back to Darius. She told him, precisely and without editorializing, what the situation was and what it was going to cost them if they didn't respond before the afternoon session started. He listened. When she finished, he said, "What do you need?" Not, "What do we do?" Not, "Here's my assessment, what do you need?" The specific question of a man who has understood that the person in front of him has already done the analysis and has a direction. And what she requires from him is not his parallel computation, but his trust in his authority. She told him. What she needed was a public withdrawal of the Kale Pass positioning before the afternoon session opened. Not a retreat, not an admission of aggression, but a formal, documented reordering described as a response to summit protocol regarding military posture during diplomatic proceedings. A clause that existed in the Graymere Accord's foundational documents and had never been invoked, which meant invoking it now would be notable and would, if handled correctly, reframe the movement as a procedural correction rather than an escalation. She needed Darius to personally deliver this to the summit moderator before the afternoon session. She needed the Thornfield houses to receive a message within the hour that the restructuring timeline was being voluntarily extended by 90 days. Not because the commitment was weakening, but because stability served all parties, and demonstrating a commitment to stability in the face of provocation was a stronger signal than holding the original aggressive line. And she needed Callan removed from all summit proceedings immediately, quietly, and with an explanation that would not invite questions. Darius absorbed all of this. "The voluntary extension," he said. "Torish will read that as retreat. Torish will read it as what I tell him it is," she said. "I'll talk to him before he hears it through other channels. The extension is not retreat. The extension is the Dominion demonstrating that we're building an empire that lasts, not making a land grab that invites coalition resistance. The distinction matters. Torish understands long-term architecture. And if the Ashthorn delegation reads it as weakness, Ryker's delegation is managing a document this morning that reveals the scale of their structural exposure. They're not in a position to press an advantage. They'll be relieved." She paused. "And that relief will cost them," she added, "because the voluntary extension comes with a modification to the commission structure that formalizes the Dominion's advisory role in the Eastern Corridor oversight. It's better for us than the original timeline. It just arrives slower." Darius looked at her for a long moment. The assessment in his eyes was not skepticism. It was the specific quality of attention of a man who is watching someone do something remarkable and is tracking it carefully enough to understand exactly how remarkable it is. "You planned for this," he said. "I planned for something like this," she said. "I knew Kalen had frictions. I didn't know the specific shape they'd take, but I built the architecture to be survivable." She met his eyes. "That's the difference between building for appearance and building for endurance. Appearances shatter. Endurance bends." He stood. He went to deliver the moderator notice. She sent for Torish. Torish was, as she had said, a man who understood long-term architecture. He was not happy about the extension. He conveyed this unhappiness in the blunt, complete way he conveyed everything, without decorative language or diplomatic cushioning, which she had always appreciated about him because it saved time. "The border command movement spooked the smaller houses," he said. "I know. If I go back to them with a timeline extension, 3 of the 11 will read it as instability in the Dominion position. 3, she said. Which 3? He told her. The Heron family and the 2 Meyerfall branches, she said. Yes, I know. They've been the least committed from the beginning. They're following the institutional momentum, not making their own assessment. If the momentum appears to stutter, they'll recalibrate. She looked at him steadily. That's why you're not announcing the extension. You're informing your closest contacts of a strategic recalibration framed as a demonstration of dominion, patience, and stability. You're telling them that the empire that can afford to slow down is the empire that has already won. The ones rushing the timeline are the ones who aren't sure of their ground. Torish was quiet. That's not wrong, he said. It's not wrong because it's true, she said. The Dominion's position is strong. What happened today was an attempt to make it look unstable. The counter is not to argue against that narrative. The counter is to behave in a way that makes the narrative obviously false. He looked at her. The Heron family, he said, will want a direct conversation. With you, not with intermediaries. Then I'll talk to them. Tonight. Then tonight, she picked up her folder. Set it up. He left. She stood alone in the room for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough to breathe fully, down to the bottom of it. The way you breathe when you have been managing the surface of yourself for hours, and the inside needs a moment of acknowledgement. What had happened today was not a defeat. She understood this with the precision of someone who has learned to distinguish between damage and destruction. They feel similar in the immediate moment and mean entirely different things. The Kaelin situation was damage. It required repair work. It had cost her time and margin. It had not, if she moved correctly in the next 3 hours, changed the fundamental outcome. But it had changed something else. It had changed her understanding of what she was doing. Because the thing she had not fully allowed herself to think, in 3 months of building, was how much of what she was building had been constructed on the implicit assumption that the new architecture would be cleaner than the old one. That the Dominion and Darius and the people around her in this new context would be different in kind from the court she had left. Not perfect. She wasn't naive enough to expect perfect. But different, organized around different incentives, producing different behaviors. Kaelin had reminded her that human nature does not change with geography. The same forces that had operated in the Ashthorn court, the competing interests, the self-serving accommodations, the small betrayals that accumulate into structural damage, operated here too. They operated everywhere that power lived. Not because people were uniformly venal, but because power creates conditions that test the specific weaknesses of whoever operates within it, and human weakness is not regional. What changed was not the environment. What changed was who you were inside it, and who she was, who she had been working deliberately and with increasing clarity to become, was someone who could survive the Kaelins of any court because she had built the architecture to absorb them, not because she had expected them, because she had known, somewhere beneath the hope, that they were always possible. This was what 4 years in the Ashthorn court had actually given her. Not the titles or the access or the institutional knowledge, though she had those. It had given her an intimate education in the specific ways that institutions betray the people inside them, and that education had made her a builder who designed for failure rather than assuming success. The distinction saved her today. It would save her again. The afternoon session proceeded. Darius delivered the moderator notice. The Kael Pass repositioning was formally documented as a procedural correction under the Greymere Accord's military posture provisions. The afternoon session moderator noted it without comment, which was the correct diplomatic response, and which, in its correctness, functioned exactly as Seraphina had said it would, as evidence of an empire that knew the rules and followed them, even when following them cost positioning. The Ashthorn delegation noticed. She watched Fen receive a whispered communication mid-session and relax by a fraction so small that only someone who knew what they were looking for would catch it. The summit's formal business continued. At 6 in the evening, when the session broke and the delegations dispersed to their respective lodgings for the dinner interval, Seraphina received a second document. This one had no seal. It had been left on the chair beside her at the Dominion table, which meant someone had placed it during the session, someone with access to the hall, which narrowed the field considerably. She opened it under the table, without looking at it directly. It was 4 lines. The commission name. I looked up the history. I understand what you meant. I want you to know that I understand what I destroyed, not in the abstract, but specifically. I don't expect this to mean anything. I needed you to know that I know. 4 lines in Ryker's handwriting, no signature. He didn't need one. She read it twice. Then she folded it. She thought about the letter in her desk drawer back at the Dominion, the accurate accounting, the understanding that had arrived too late. She thought about what Evelise had said in the small reception room. I think I made a mistake, with the roughness of genuine honesty at the edge of it. She thought about the fact that understanding was not the same as being someone different, and that she had believed this completely and still believed it. And she thought because she was honest about the specific, complicated material of what she actually felt, that Ryker's 4 lines had landed somewhere, not where they would have landed 4 years ago, not where they would have landed even 6 months ago, but somewhere, in the part of her that had genuinely loved him and had not stopped loving him in any simple or clean way, that had simply directed that love elsewhere, toward herself mostly, toward the work, toward the life she was building, toward the future that was still taking its shape. She put the note in her folder. She went to dinner. The Heron family meeting happened at 9 that evening, in a private dining room that one of Torish's contacts had arranged without leaving a clear trail to either the Dominion delegation or Seraphina herself. Lord Heron was 61, deliberate, with the specific caution of a man whose family had survived 3 regional conflicts by correctly identifying which direction to lean before the decisive moment. He looked at her across the small table with the eyes of a man taking a measurement. The border incident, he said, was an unauthorized action by a mid-level operator who has since been removed from summit proceedings, she said. The Dominion's position is unchanged. Our commitment to the Eastern Corridor restructuring is unchanged. The timeline adjustment is a demonstration of confidence, not a retreat. The small houses will follow the institutional momentum, she said. That's their pattern, and it's not changing. The question is where the institutional momentum points after tonight. That depends on what you do. He looked at her for a long moment. You're asking me to hold, he said. I'm telling you the situation accurately and letting you make your own assessment, she said. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm offering you the actual information rather than the version designed to produce the response I want. Why? Because you'll make a better decision with accurate information, and a better decision serves everyone here, including me. Another pause. My grandfather, Heron said, used to say that the most dangerous person in any negotiation was the one who didn't need anything from you. Your grandfather was right. You don't need me. Not individually, she said. Collectively, the northern houses matter for the durability of the restructuring. But I don't need you so badly that I'm willing to give you a distorted picture to secure your participation. That's not how I build things. He looked at her. My grandfather, he said, also said that the rarest thing in any court is someone who means what they say. She said nothing. I'll hold, he said. She nodded once, the nod of someone who has received what they came for and doesn't require additional ceremony around it. She left the dinner at 10:30. She walked back through the Accord Hall corridors, which were quieting now, the heavy political traffic of the day thinning toward the private hours. The guards nodded at the Dominion insignia. The night staff moved with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned that significant things happened in halls like this one, and that their survival depended on being present without registering. She was halfway back to the Dominion section when she heard it. Voices. 2 of them. In the side corridor that connected the formal meeting rooms to the back of the building. One voice she recognized as a Dominion military advisor, a man named Reth, who had been in Darius's service for years and who she had always found professionally reliable without having formed any particular assessment of his deeper character. The other voice she did not recognize. She stopped. She stood very still in the way she had learned, over years of navigating courts that talked in corners, to stand when she needed to hear something without announcing her presence. The voices were not loud, but the corridor carried sound in the way of old stone construction, and she caught enough. Reth was saying something about timing, about the summit's final session, about a communication that needed to go out before dawn. The other voice said something she didn't catch fully, But the name she caught was clear. The name was Darius. And the tone was not the tone of someone relaying their commander's instructions. It was the tone of someone talking about their commander. She pressed herself against the wall. The conversation lasted another 40 seconds. Then the voices separated. Reth moved away from her, deeper into the back corridor. The other voice went the opposite direction. She stood in the stone-cold corridor and breathed and felt the specific vertigo of a world that has just shifted beneath her feet for the second time in one day. Kellen had been running information to the Ashthorn Border Command. Reth, a different Dominion insider, a different channel, was apparently running something else entirely. Something that involved Darius and timing and a communication that needed to go out before the summit's final session. She had built her architecture to be survivable. She had believed the foundation was sound. She had not yet reckoned with the possibility that the damage was not in the walls or the roof. It was in the floor. And now, standing in the corridor of the Greymere Accord Hall at 10:45 in the evening, with one day left in the summit that was supposed to secure everything she had spent 3 months constructing, Seraphina Vale faced the question she had not prepared an answer for. Not the question of what to do next. She would figure out what to do next. She always did. The question was simpler and more devastating than strategy. The question was, how much of what she had built was actually hers, and how much of it had been built on a foundation she had been allowed to believe was solid because someone had needed her to keep building? The corridor was empty and cold, and the stone walls held the echo of voices that had already moved on. She stood in it, and for the first time in 3 months, for the first time since she had walked out of the Moon Palace with her 2 cases, and her clarity and her certainty that she was moving toward something real, she did not know what to do next. Not because she had run out of options, because the woman who chose between options had to know, first, what ground she was actually standing on. And the ground had just moved. She moved. Not away from the corridor, not toward it. She moved laterally through the narrow servants' passage that ran parallel to the main hall, the one she had identified on her second day at the Greymere Accord Hall, because identifying secondary routes was a habit she had built in 4 years of navigating spaces that were never entirely safe. She moved quietly, with the compressed efficiency of someone who has decided that stillness is no longer available as an option, and she tracked Reth's footsteps through the stone by sound until she understood where he was going, the back communications room. The one the Dominion delegation used for encrypted dispatches. She knew the room. She had used it twice herself. She did not follow him into it. She went instead to the room adjacent, a storage space, rarely occupied, with a shared wall thin enough that sound moved through it with the particular clarity of old construction that had settled and cracked along its mortar lines over decades of seasonal expansion and contraction. She pressed her back against the wall, breathed shallow, listened. Reth was not alone. Someone had come in through the room's secondary entrance, the one that faced the building's exterior courtyard. She could not identify the second voice. It was low, kept deliberately low. The voice of someone who understood that sound traveled in stone buildings and had adjusted accordingly. What she caught, over 6 minutes of cold-walled stillness, was enough. The communication was not going to the Ashthorn Border Command. It was not going to any of the summit's formal diplomatic channels. It was going to a destination she did not immediately recognize, a name, a location reference, something in the northern interior of the Dominion's own territory. And the content of it, assembled from the fragments she was catching, was not about the summit, it was about after the summit, about what happened to the trade restructuring framework once Seraphina's direct advisory role was. And here the word Reth used was one she felt land in her sternum like a stone dropped from height, concluded. She stood in the storage room with the cold coming through the wall and the sound of a man discussing the architecture of her removal, and she felt something move through her that was not fear and not anger, and not the familiar cold clarity she reached for when situations required it. It was older than any of those things. It was the specific animal recognition of a creature that has been maneuvered into a corner and has just understood the geometry of the trap. She went to Darius at 11 that night. She did not knock. She opened the door of his private office in the Dominion section and walked in and closed it behind her and looked at him across the desk with the direct, undecorated look of someone who has decided that they are beyond the point where careful framing serves any purpose. He read her face. He set down his pen. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Precisely, completely in the order it had happened. Reth, the corridor, the storage room, the 6 minutes of cold-walled listening, the fragments of a conversation about what happened to her advisory role after the summit. When she finished, Darius was very still. The stillness of him was not the stillness of a man managing surprise. It was the stillness of a man who has just had a piece of information land that rearranges the meaning of several other pieces of information he already had, which meant she understood in real time that this was not completely new to him. "Darius," she said, "I have known," he said carefully, "that there are people in my command structure who are not comfortable with the speed and the scope of what we have been building. This is not unusual. Expansion at this pace creates institutional friction. It always does." "That's not what I heard in that corridor." "No." He looked at the desk. "It isn't." "There's a faction," she said. Not a question. "There has been a faction," he said, "since before you came. They believe the Eastern expansion is strategically sound. They're less certain about the architecture of the advisory role, about a chief strategic advisor who came from outside the Dominion, who arrived with loyalties that began elsewhere, who is now holding the primary intelligence position in the most consequential summit the Dominion has attended in 20 years. She looked at him. "They don't trust me," she said. "Some of them don't trust the situation," he said. "The distinction matters." "Does it?" She sat down, not because she was tired, but because the conversation required the kind of settled presence that standing at the door did not allow. "Walk me through what concluded means, in their framing. What does that look like?" Darius met her eyes. "After the summit," he said, "a formal restructuring of the advisory function. The Eastern expansion continues. The trade framework proceeds, but the chief advisor position is reorganized, distributed across multiple existing roles rather than consolidated in a single external appointment. They want to take apart what I built and redistribute it to people they control. They want institutional architecture that feels native to the Dominion rather than imported. That's a cleaner way of saying the same thing." "Yes," he said. "It is." She sat with this, the specific weight of it. 3 months of work. Not just the summit preparation, not just the Eastern restructuring, but the deeper infrastructure, the relationships and trust and institutional knowledge she had been rebuilding from scratch in a new context. All of it, useful to them, extractable from her, separable from the person who had built it. The same dynamic, a different empire, the same fundamental logic. Take what she built, use what she made, and then find a way to do without her that didn't require acknowledging what she'd contributed. She had walked out of one version of this. She was sitting inside another one. This is the thing about escaping a pattern. Escape requires knowing what you're escaping, not just where you're going. She had left the Ashthorn court with clarity about what she was leaving and hope about what she was moving toward. The hope had been genuine. The hope had not been wrong. But hope, however genuine, does not inoculate against the repetition of structural dynamics. The dynamics follow because they live in systems, not in specific places or specific people. And systems reproduce themselves wherever they find compatible conditions. She had provided compatible conditions, not through naivety, through the specific vulnerability of someone who wanted to believe that this time the ground was different. "What are you going to do?" she said. The question was direct. It was also, beneath the directness, something else. The question of a woman who has been betrayed once by a man she trusted and is now sitting across from a second man she has been trusting and needs to understand with complete accuracy what she is actually looking at. Darius understood what she was asking. He stood up from the desk. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark courtyard below, and she watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he carried the weight of what he was deciding. "I built this expansion on a foundation," he said, without turning. "The foundation is you, not your institutional knowledge, not the trade documentation. You. The way you think, the way you hold complexity without flinching, the way you build things that are designed to last rather than to impress." He paused. "Anyone who believes that can be extracted and redistributed has not understood what they are actually looking at." She said nothing. "Reth will be removed from summit proceedings," he said. "Tonight, before dawn, before whatever communication he was planning to send goes out." He turned from the window. "And tomorrow, before the final session, I am going to stand in front of my full delegation and clarify, in terms that do not permit reinterpretation, what the chief strategic advisor's role is and what it will continue to be. She looked at him. That creates a faction problem you'll have to manage for years, she said. Yes. They won't stop. They'll wait and find another angle. Probably, he said. That's what factions do. The answer to that is not to capitulate preemptively. The answer is to be so clearly, durably right about the decision that the faction runs out of ground to stand on. She held his gaze for a long moment, looking for the gap between what he was saying and what he meant, the way she looked for it in everyone, the way 4 years in a court that said one thing and did another had trained her to look. She did not find one. She did not find one, and the finding, the specific experience of looking for a gap and encountering only the solid, reliable mass of a man who meant what he said, produced something in her chest that was not relief, exactly. It was more complicated than relief. It was the complicated response of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact feels almost as disorienting as the impact would have. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. She stood. I'll need to talk to Torish before the morning session, she said, and I need the Heron confirmation in writing. If Reth's communication got out before I found him— It didn't, Darius said. I have the room monitored. I know you did too. She stopped. You knew about the corridor, she said. I knew Reth was meeting someone tonight. I didn't know the content. His gray eyes were steady. I was going to tell you in the morning. You were going to tell me in the morning, she repeated. Yes. She looked at him for a moment that stretched. Next time, she said, tell me the same night. Next time, he said, I will. She left. At 4 a.m, Seraphina was still working. The table in her section of the Dominion's lodgings was covered in documentation. The Heron written confirmation that had arrived at midnight through Torish's contact, the modified commission structure she had been redrafting since 2, the legal amendments to the Greymere Accord provisions that she needed for the final session's Eastern Corridor segment. The candle beside her had burned down twice and been replaced. Her eyes were dry. Her back ached in the specific way of someone who has been sitting in the same position for too long and has not given themselves permission to stop. There was a cup of tea at her elbow that had gone cold an hour ago and that she reached for occasionally without noticing it was cold. This is what it actually looks like. The building of empires. Not the summit sessions with their formal procedures and their diplomatic language. Not the grand moments of confrontation and revelation. This. 4 a.m, a table covered in documents, the kind of tired that has moved past physical sensation into a state that is simply the new baseline, and the work in front of you that will not be done by anyone else if you do not do it. She had spent 4 years doing this in a palace that had decided she was furniture. She was doing it now in a context where the man she worked with would stand in front of his delegation in 4 hours and stake his institutional credibility on the position that she was not furniture. The difference was not the work. The work was identical. The difference was what the work built toward. She finished the commission redraft at 5:15. She read it through once, made 3 corrections, and set it aside for the final session. At 5:45, she went to find Darius. He was already awake. He had, she was discovering, a similar relationship to early morning hours. The specific productivity of someone who understood that the hours before the day's demands arrived were not to be wasted on sleep when something important needed doing. He looked at the redraft. He read it the way he read everything she gave him, fully, attending to the actual content rather than performing attention. When he finished, he looked up. The modified commission structure gives us more than the original, he said. Yes, the 90-day extension was a cost. The restructured oversight provisions are a gain. Net position is stronger than where we started yesterday morning. How? Because the extension forced a renegotiation of the commission's scope, and I used the renegotiation to formalize the Dominion's advisory role in a way the original timeline didn't require. We got to the same destination and acquired something additional in transit. She paused. Crises are leverage if you're fast enough. He almost smiled. The almost smile that she had come to recognize as his version of a full one. The faction, she said, before the session. I'll address it at 7. I don't need to be there. No, he agreed. I think it's better if you're not. She nodded. I'll be in the Eastern Reading Room. Send someone when it's done. The messenger arrived at 7:42. She read the single line on the paper. It's handled. Come to the hall. She gathered her documents. The final session of the Sovereign Summit convened at 9 in the morning with the particular atmosphere of an ending, the specific quality of a gathering that has been running for 5 days and has now arrived at the moment where what has been negotiated must be formalized, where the positions people have been maneuvering into must be held and declared. The Ashthorn delegation was in place when she arrived. Fenn was at his position with the careful composure of a man who had been doing this for 20 years and understood that the final session was where careers were made or ended, and that composure was the minimum requirement for either outcome. Ryker was at the head of the table. He looked, in the morning light of the Accord Hall's narrow windows, like a man who had not slept, not in the way of fatigue, but in the way of someone who has been awake with intention, who has spent the dark hours thinking rather than resting, because resting would have required a stillness of mind he didn't have access to. He looked at her when she entered. She looked back, and then the session moderator called the room to order, and they both looked forward, because that was what the moment required. The Eastern Corridor segment came up in the second hour. She presented the Dominion's position, 30 pages, reduced to a 12-minute verbal argument that hit every structural point without unnecessary elaboration. She had been condensing complex material into precise verbal presentation for 4 years, and she was very good at it. When she finished, the moderator opened the floor for responses. Fenn spoke for the Ashthorn delegation. He was good. She had always known he was good, which was why she had been honest with him about the Southeastern Gap in the first session. He found 3 legitimate points of contest in the commission structure, raised them cleanly, and proposed specific modifications. She listened. 2 of his modifications she rejected outright, in the measured language of someone who doesn't need to be aggressive to be unmovable. 1 of them she accepted. The acceptance was deliberate, not a concession extracted under pressure, but a genuine recognition that Fenn's third point improved the Commission's function. She accepted it in the language of someone who knows the difference between giving ground and improving structure, and who is not so committed to the appearance of winning that she'll reject a good idea because it came from the other side. The room noticed. The room always noticed these things because the people in it were professionals whose entire function was noticing the difference between strategic maneuvering and genuine collaborative adjustment. The session continued. At 12:15, Ryker spoke directly for the first time in the session. He had been the Alpha King at the head of the table for 3 hours, present, attentive, reading the room with that practiced governing stillness. His intervention was sudden, and it was not about the commission structure. "I want to raise a point that is outside the formal agenda," he said. The moderator paused. The room paused. Seraphina's hands were still on the table in front of her. "The Eastern Corridor restructuring as proposed," Ryker said, "represents a fundamental realignment of the trade infrastructure that has supported this region for 40 years. I want to state formally, for the record, that the Ashthorn Empire acknowledges the legitimacy of the Dominion's position in this restructuring." He paused. "And I want to acknowledge, for the record, the architect of that position." The room was very quiet. "Chief Strategic Advisor Vale's work," he said, "represents the most sophisticated trade infrastructure analysis this summit has seen in 20 years of convening. The Ashthorn Empire objects to several of its conclusions. It does not object to the quality of its construction." He looked at her. She looked back. The specific thing that moved across his face in that moment was not performance. It was not diplomacy. It was the look of a man doing one of the hardest things a powerful person can do, publicly acknowledging the full magnitude of what they lost, in front of every power that matters, with no benefit to themselves in the acknowledgement. He was not doing it to get her back. He was doing it because it was true, and because he had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of the night before, that being the man who told the truth about this was the one remaining thing he could get right. She held his gaze for the length of a full breath. Then she said, "The Ashthorn Empire's acknowledgement is noted. I suggest we return to the commission structure's implementation timeline." And the session continued. The formal documents were signed at 3 in the afternoon. She watched the ink dry on her own signature, Chief Strategic Advisor, Crimson Dominion, and felt the specific finality of something that has been in motion for a long time, arriving at the form it was always going to take. The delegations began to disperse. She was gathering her documents when she became aware that Ryker was standing 3 feet to her left, not approaching, just there. The way he had sometimes simply appeared in the same space she was in, across 4 years of shared orbit, before the orbit had slowly widened until they were in different trajectories entirely. She finished gathering her documents, straightened. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. It cost you. I know that too." He looked at the table, the cleared table, the documents that had been gathered and folded and taken away, the physical evidence of what had just been formally decided. "I've been making decisions based on what they cost me for a long time. I thought I was being strategic." He paused. "I was being small." She said nothing. "The commission name," he said. "I need you to know I understand what it means, not just what we talked about, what it meant that you kept it, that you built something real and put that name on it instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of letting it be just a wound." She looked at him, at the lines around his eyes that were deeper now, at the jaw that had its governing tension, and beneath it something different than she had seen there in years. Not the tension of command, but the specific, costly openness of a man who has decided to stop managing his own face. "It was never just a wound," she said. "That was the point." He nodded, slow, absorbing. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here with an offer or an argument. I just needed you to know that I know, specifically, the size of it. You said that in the note." "I know. I'm saying it again." He met her eyes, out loud, in front of the room. The room was mostly empty now. A few attendants, a couple of Dominion staff, Fenn across the way carefully not looking at them. But it was not nothing. It was not private. He had chosen this too. The public saying of it. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 4 years, about the moon bond and the ballroom and the East Terrace and the letter she had left and the road she had taken. About the 3 months of building, about Kalen and Reth and Heron and the cold corridor at 11 at night, about the commission with its specific name, about the document that was now signed with her full title on it. "I know you know," she said. "I believe you know. That matters." She picked up her folder. "It doesn't change anything, but it matters." His throat moved. He nodded. She walked toward the door. She was 4 steps from it when a sound reached the hall from outside. Not a knock, not a formal announcement, but the rapid impact of boots on stone that trained ears recognize as someone moving with urgency that exceeds ordinary urgency. The 2 guards at the outer doors exchanged a look and moved, and then the doors opened and a Dominion courier came through at a pace that broke every protocol of the Accord Hall's formal space. He went directly to Seraphina. He pressed a sealed document into her hands. She read it. The blood left her face in the way it left faces when something cold and large replaces everything else. Darius appeared at her left shoulder. He had been at the far end of the hall when the courier arrived and had crossed it in the time it took her to read the document once. "What is it?" he said. She handed it to him. He read it. The color did not leave his face the way it left hers. His went something else, something harder, something that had edges. "When?" he said to the courier. 3 hours ago. The initial report. The full situation is still, get my military advisors, now." Darius looked at Seraphina. "All of them, the main session room. 2 minutes." The courier went. The remaining delegations in the hall had registered the disruption and were doing the thing that political professionals do when something significant occurs in their proximity. They became very still and very attentive, while performing the appearance of going about their business. Ryker was still standing where she had left him. He had seen her face when she read the document. He had the specific stillness of a man who does not yet know what has happened, but has read the physical language of the people who do and has understood that it is serious. "What happened?" he said. She looked at him. There was a version of this moment in which she told him nothing, in which the information in that document was Dominion intelligence and therefore not his business, and she walked into the session room and closed the door. There was another version. She chose the version that was true because she was, at the bottom of everything, someone who made choices based on what was accurate rather than what was advantageous, even when accuracy was the harder direction. "The gray veil passes," she said. All three of them. He went still. There's been a third-party movement, she said. Not Ashthorn, not Dominion, something else. Something that has been watching both of us maneuver for 5 days and has decided that the moment both major powers are occupied with a summit and a signed trade agreement is the moment to move into the space between us, Ryker said. Flat. The Alpha King's voice, stripped of everything except the clarity of a man whose mind has just accelerated to war speed. Yes. He looked at her. She looked back. And in the space between them, in the air between the man who had lost her and the woman who had built herself back from that losing, the specific, ugly reality of a continent that had been watching them fight each other settled into the room like something physical. They had been so occupied with each other. They had been so precise in their maneuvering, so focused on the trade restructuring and the commission structure, and the 20 years of political architecture they were dismantling and rebuilding between them, that neither of them had fully attended to the third possibility. That someone else had been waiting for exactly this. For the moment, the two most powerful empires on the continent were looking at each other, and not at the door. Seraphina's mind was moving at a speed that felt like physical sensation, the rapid parallel processing of implications, positions, logistics, vulnerabilities. The Grey Veil passes controlled access to both empires' northern territories. If the passes were compromised, the trade framework they had just signed was strategically irrelevant. If the passes were held by a third party, the Dominion's eastern expansion and the Ashthorn Empire's northern corridor were both exposed in ways that no signed document could address. Everything she had built for 3 months. Everything Ryker had been trying to hold together for 3 months. Both of them, suddenly, facing the same direction, toward the same threat. She turned toward the session room where Darius's advisors were assembling. She stopped. She turned back. Ryker! Her voice was the voice of a chief strategic advisor addressing the Alpha King of the Ashthorn Empire. Not Sarah, not the Luna. The professional addressing the professional. Your Northern Border Command, what's your current troop positioning at the Grey Veil approaches? He answered immediately. The Alpha King, with nothing managed about his voice now, with the pure functional precision of a ruler responding to a crisis with the relevant information. She listened. She calculated. The Dominion's eastern positioning and the Ashthorn northern corridor taken separately were both insufficient. Taken together, coordinated with the information she now held about both sides' actual capacity, they were something else. They were, potentially, enough. Come with me, she said. He looked at her. To the session room, she said. Both delegations. 30 minutes. She held his gaze. We can do this separately, or we can do it right. Those are the only two options available, and we don't have time to negotiate which one. He understood. She knew he understood because she knew how his mind moved when it was running at speed. And she saw it move now, past the history, past the summit, past the 4 years and the moon bond, and the note and the signed documents, straight to the actual situation in front of them. Fen, he said. Fen appeared at his shoulder. Sir. Get the delegation, full military advisors, session room. He looked at Seraphina. Now? Now, she said. She walked into the session room. The advisors were assembling. Dominion military staff on one side, and then within 90 seconds, Ashthorn advisors filing in on the other, the two delegations occupying the same room for a purpose that no one in the Accord Hall had anticipated when the morning began. She stood at the head of the table. Not the Dominion side. The head. Where the moderator had been all week. Nobody contested it. Not because she demanded it, because she was the person in the room with the fullest picture. Both sides' positions, both sides' capacities, the third party's timing and probable objectives, and the specific combination of resources that could, if deployed correctly in the next 6 hours, close the gap before it became a breach. She spread the document on the table. She looked at the assembled faces. Dominion advisors, Ashthorn advisors, Darius at her left, Ryker at her right. The two empires that had been pulling against each other for 5 days now pulled in the same direction by the same threat. She began to talk. And outside the narrow windows of the Greymere Accord Hall, in the mountain passes 3 hours to the north, Something was moving through the dark that had been patient for a very long time and had chosen this exact moment to stop being patient. The next 6 hours would determine whether what she had built survived, whether what Ryker had tried to save survived, whether the continent these two empires between them held together would hold. And she was the only person in the room who could see all of it clearly enough to have a chance. She kept talking. The room listened. And outside, the dark kept moving. She talked for 40 minutes. Not because the situation required 40 minutes of explanation. She could have compressed the essential strategic picture into 10. She took 40 because the people in the room needed to understand not just what was happening, but why it was happening. What sequence of conditions had produced this specific vulnerability at this specific moment, so that when she proposed the response, they would not be following her instructions blindly, but would be following their own understanding of a situation she had helped them see clearly. This was the difference between leadership and command. Command produced compliance. Leadership produced people who could function when the plan met reality and fractured. She had learned this difference in 4 years of watching command fail in rooms where leadership was what the moment required. The third party, the intelligence from the border document, identified them as the Veyrath Collective, a loose confederacy of northern territories that had spent 2 decades accumulating resources and positioning while the continent's major powers watched each other, had moved through the secondary Greyveil approach, the one that neither the Dominion's Eastern Garrison nor the Ashthorn Northern Border Command had adequately weighted as a priority because both had been oriented toward watching each other. The collective had been watching both. They had been patient with the specific patience of powers who understand that the opportune moment is not the moment you are strongest. It is the moment your adversaries are most occupied with each other. 5 days of summit proceedings. 2 major empires negotiating a fundamental trade realignment. Every significant military and diplomatic asset within 300 miles seated in the Greymere Accord Hall, performing the elaborate ritual of continental politics. The collective had moved at dawn on the summit's final day. They were not invading, not in the conventional sense. They were positioning, the same kind of pre-positioning that the Dominion's forces had performed at Kyle Pass, but executed with the advantage of a party that had not been constrained by summit protocols and had not needed to pull back for diplomatic reasons. They were in the passes. And once a third party held the Greyveil passes, the strategic map of the continent changed in ways that made every document signed in the Greymere Accord Hall that afternoon functionally irrelevant. When she finished, the room was quiet in the specific way of people who have just been shown a picture they cannot unsee. Darius spoke first. The Eastern Garrison can be repositioned to the secondary approach. 6 hours. 5, said his senior military advisor. If we authorize the northern detachment to move simultaneously. Do it, Darius said. She looked at Ryker. He was already looking at her. The Northern Border Command, he said. I can have the Kyle contingent redirected through the old Ridge Road. It bypasses the main passes and comes in above the collective's current position. That's a hard march in the dark, Fenn said. Yes, Ryker agreed. It is. He was not asking permission. He was not asking for her assessment. He was telling her what he had and what he intended to do with it, and the specific quality of how he told her was the quality of 2 professionals coordinating rather than 2 adversaries conceding. She had not experienced this from him in a very long time. She had forgotten, until this moment, that it had once been the normal texture of how they worked together. The particular ease of 2 minds running in the same direction before the direction had diverged. The Ridge Road approach comes out here, she said, putting her finger on the map that Darius's aide had spread across the table. If the Dominion's Eastern Garrison reaches the secondary approach simultaneously, we close both ends, Darius said. We close both ends, she confirmed. The collective is positioned for a holding action, not a contested engagement. Their strategy depends on having enough territory to negotiate from. Take the negotiating position away. And they have a logistical problem that makes their position untenable within 48 hours, Ryker finished. The room looked at this, then looked at the 2 empires on either side of the table and made the calculation that political professionals make when they understand that the map has changed. Coordinated, Fenn said. Not a question. The assessment of a man who has spent 20 years in diplomatic service and is recognizing in real time something he has not seen before. Coordinated, Seraphina confirmed. The orders went out. Ting. The next 6 hours were the kind of hours that compress in memory and expand in experience, each individual moment carrying a weight that the clock didn't account for, while the whole of it seemed, in retrospect, to have passed in a single held breath. She worked from the session room with Darius's military advisors, and Ryker's delegation intermingled in a configuration that would have been unimaginable 48 hours earlier. Not comfortably. There was nothing comfortable about it, nothing that smoothed over the weight of the trade documents still drying on the table in the main hall or the specific history of every person in the room. But functionally, with the raw, unglamorous competence of people who understand that the situation in front of them is more important than the situation behind them. Seraphina moved between the Dominion's tactical planning and the Ashthorn delegation's logistical coordination with the ease of someone who had spent 3 months deeply understanding both sides' institutional capacity. This was, she recognized with a clarity that was almost detached, exactly the thing the Dominion's internal faction had wanted to eliminate: the specific value of a person who could hold both pictures simultaneously, who could translate between two sets of institutional languages without losing the precision of either. It was also, she recognized, the thing she had been doing in one form or another for her entire career: holding complexity, moving between systems, keeping the picture complete when every pressure pushed toward fragmentation. She had spent years doing it invisibly, in a palace that had not known it needed to see her. She was doing it now with her name on the door. At 9 in the evening, the first confirmation arrived from the Dominion's eastern garrison. The secondary approach had been reached. The collective's positioning at that end was contested. At 10:40, confirmation from the Ashthorn Ridge contingent, the northern approach was closed. The Ridge Road march had been hard and dark, and had cost several hours of daylight on the other end, but the contingent had moved and they were in position. The room absorbed this in silence. Then someone exhaled. Then someone else. And the peculiar, exhausted relief of a crisis that has been correctly managed began to settle through the space. Ryker found her on the Accord Hall's exterior steps at 11:30. She had come out for air, which was something she had done periodically through the evening whenever the room's compressed tension had needed a counterweight. The night was cold in the way of mountain country in autumn, with a clarity to the dark that came from elevation and dry air, and she stood on the steps with her arms crossed and her breath visible and her eyes on the valley below where the trade roads were dark and quiet, and she felt, for the first time since the courier had arrived with his sealed document, like she could take a full breath. Ryker came out and stood beside her. Not close. The distance of people who have been inside a working relationship for 6 hours and are stepping briefly outside it without yet knowing what the air between them is going to be. They stood in silence for a while. This was something they had always been able to do: be silent together without the silence becoming a problem. It was one of the first things she had noticed about him a long time ago. The specific quality of someone who didn't need to fill space with sound. She had missed it, not consciously, not in a way she had allowed herself to name. But standing beside it now, she recognized the missing of it the way you recognize something familiar in a different context. Suddenly, with the slight disorientation of a thing restored to a place you had stopped expecting to find it. "It worked," he said. "It worked." "Your read on the collective strategy," he said, "the logistical vulnerability. You were right. The intelligence was there, it just needed to be assembled correctly." "Seraphina." He turned to look at her. "Stop doing that." She looked at him. "Stop minimizing it," he said. "I did that to you for 4 years. I let you minimize it, and I benefited from the minimizing, and I never said, 'You were right.' You, not the intelligence, not the situation. You." He held her eyes. "You held that room tonight. You held 2 empires in the same room, and you made them move in the same direction, and you were right about all of it." She was quiet. There is a particular difficulty in receiving acknowledgement from someone whose failure to give it has cost you significantly. It does not produce simple gratitude. It produces something more complicated. The layered response of a person who needed this a long time ago and is receiving it now, too late for it to have prevented what it would have prevented, but not so late that it means nothing. It meant something. She did not intend to pretend it didn't. "Thank you," she said. Simple, without the managed distance she might have reached for. He looked at the valley. "Evelise and I," he said, "ended before the summit began. I want you to know that, not because it changes anything. I understand that it doesn't change anything. Just, I want you to know that the thing you left wasn't something I replaced you with. I realized what I'd done and I couldn't continue what I'd been using to avoid seeing it clearly. She absorbed this. How is she? She said. He looked at her, surprised, possibly, that this was the question. Managing, he said. She's honest with herself, more than I gave her credit for. I know. Seraphina looked at the dark valley. She told me she thought she'd made a mistake, directly, without asking me to do anything with the information. She has more integrity than the position she was in allowed her to show. Most people do. Silence. What happens now, he said, for the Dominion, for the Commission. The Commission proceeds as documented. The Eastern restructuring continues on the adjusted timeline. The collective situation will require a joint response protocol. That's 3 months of negotiation at minimum, probably 6, and it should produce a formal defensive coordination agreement between the Dominion and the Empire. She paused. Which is in retrospect an outcome that benefits both parties considerably more than 5 more years of positioning against each other. The collective did us a favor, he said. The collective did what every external threat does, she said. It clarified what mattered. He nodded. Looking at the valley, at the trade road she had been rebuilding into something that would outlast the people who were currently maneuvering over them. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know that whatever you say, I'm not going to push back on it. I'm asking because I need to know, not because I think knowing will change the answer. She waited. Was there a version, he said, of this, where things went differently? Not, I don't mean early, I don't mean before everything went wrong, I mean after you left, after you'd built what you built. Was there ever a version, in your mind, where you came back? She thought about the letter in her desk drawer, the accurate accounting, the 4 lines on the unsigned note, the commission's name, the specific complicated weight of a person she had loved genuinely and who had failed her genuinely and who had, in the end, shown up in the accord hall and told the truth about the size of what he'd lost. She thought about Darius and the archive and the river water patience and I want to understand what you want, and the faction he had faced down this morning, and what do you need at 11 at night when the floor had shifted under her. She thought about who she was now, not in comparison to who she had been. That comparison had stopped being useful months ago. But in and of itself, the specific person she had become in the space that leaving had created, the chief strategic advisor with her name on a document that had just helped hold a continent together. The woman who had walked out of the Moon Palace with 2 cases and a clarity that had been tested 6 ways since and had held. No, she said. He nodded, slowly, the nod of a man receiving something he already knew. Not because of you specifically, she said, because of who I am now. Going back would require becoming someone I'm not anymore, and I won't do that. Not for you, not for anyone. I know, he said. I think I knew when I asked. Then why ask? Because I needed to hear it from you, directly, so that I know, completely, without the version of hope that lives in ambiguity, that what I lost is not coming back. He looked at her. And so that I can stop spending energy on the possibility of it and start spending that energy on something that's actually possible. She looked at him, at the Alpha King who had held an empire and mishandled the most important thing inside it, and was standing on the steps of a neutral hall in mountain country at midnight telling her the truth about what he was doing and why. He was different. She could see it. Not different the way someone who has rehearsed different is different. Not the performance of having learned something, but the way a person who has been genuinely broken open by their own choices and has sat inside the breaking and come out the other side, knowing something real looks different. Older in a way that was not about years. She did not love him less for this. She did not love him more. She loved him the way you love something that has become history, fully, truly, and in the past tense, in the way that the past tense does not diminish love, but gives it its final, accurate shape. The defensive coordination talks, she said. When they convene, you should send Fen. He looked at her. He's your best, she said. Don't waste him on the Eastern Territories. The coordination talks are where the next 20 years of this continent's shape gets decided. Send your best. He was quiet for a moment. Will you be across the table? He said. Probably. Then I'll send my best, he said. Something moved between them that was not quite a smile and was not quite grief, and was, she thought, the exact emotional texture of two people who have loved each other and lost each other, and found, on the other side of all of it, that they respect each other completely. Ryker, she said. Yes. Build something good with what's left. I mean that. She looked at the valley one last time. Not for me, not to prove something, just because you're capable of it, and the empire you have deserves it. Build something that doesn't require erasing people to function. He stood with that for a moment. I'm working on it, he said. She believed him. She left the steps before he did. Darius was waiting in the interior corridor, which she had expected. He had the specific quality of a man who understood the difference between space someone needed to take alone and space they'd been taking long enough. He looked at her face when she came in from the cold. All right, he said. Yes. He nodded. No follow-up, no analysis, no... She had been noting this about him for months. The way he asked what he needed to ask and stopped at the boundary of what was hers. It was not distance. It was the specific respect of someone who understood that the interior of another person was not territory to be managed. The garrison confirmation came in while you were outside, he said. The collective has begun a managed withdrawal from the secondary approach. How long until they're clear? 12 hours, 14 at most. She nodded. Then it's done. For now, he said. For now, she agreed. The follow-on negotiation will take 6 months and produce a defensive coordination agreement. I'll have a preliminary framework ready in 3 weeks. Of course you will, he said, not sarcastically. With the quiet warmth of someone who has learned what to expect from the person beside them and finds the expectation consistently, genuinely met. She looked at him, at the man who had asked her what she wanted when nobody else had thought to ask, who had stood in front of his delegation and staked his credibility on a truth that faction pressure had tried to make negotiable, who had said, "What do you need in the dark of a crisis?" and had meant it without conditions. The commission name, she said. He looked at her. When we formally convene the Joint Commission, she said, I want to change the name, not eliminate it, modify it. She held his gaze. I want to add the Dominion's foundational charter date to the name so that it reads both of what it was and what it became. He was quiet. What was it? He said. The original name. You never told me. She told him. It was the name of a place, a valley in the northern Ashthorn territories, one she and Ryker had spoken about once in the early years, before everything had calcified, when they had been the kind of people who talked about what they would build someday. A small word, a private reference, the kind of name that only meant something to the people who knew why it had been chosen. Darius looked at her. That's a significant thing to carry into something new, he said. Yes, she said. That's the point. He understood. She saw him understand. Not the detail of it, not the private history embedded in the name, but the principle of it, the specific intentionality of a person who refuses to build the future on erasure of the past, who insists instead on integrating the full truth of where she has been into the thing she is building now. Because this is what distinguishes a person who has genuinely survived something from a person who has merely outlasted it. The survivor carries what happened, not as a wound. Wounds close, scar over, fade to the place where they can be forgotten. She carried it as material, as the specific knowledge that comes only from having been inside a thing and come through it with your eyes open. She knew what invisible labor cost. She knew what eroded trust smelled like before it collapsed. She knew the exact shape of a room that has decided you are furniture and the specific energy required to refuse that designation and leave. She knew all of this, and she had built it into the architecture of what she was making so that the thing she built would not require its people to be invisible in order to function. This was the real work. Not the trade documents, not the commission structure, not the defensive coordination agreement that would take 6 months to negotiate. The real work was building something that treated the people inside it as the source of its strength rather than the cost of its operation. She had learned what that required by living inside its absence. Modify the name, Darius said. Whatever you want it to say. She nodded. They walked back toward the main hall together, where the evening's remaining business waited. The formal documentation of the collective response, the preliminary coordination records, the administrative machinery of a crisis successfully managed. At the door she stopped. She looked back once, toward the exterior steps where Ryker had stood, and beyond them at the dark mountain valley, and beyond that at the continent laid out in the dark like a map of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. She thought about the woman who had stood beneath chandeliers in the Moon Palace's grand hall and smiled the smile of a person who has finally understood something. She had understood that night that Ryker would not follow if she left. She had not understood then the full size of what she was capable of. She understood it now, not with the particular pride that needs to be displayed, not with the bitterness that needs to be witnessed, not with any of the emotions that require an audience to complete themselves, with the quiet, internal knowledge of a person who has been tested in the specific ways that reveal what a person actually is, not what they present, not what they hope, not what they perform, but what is genuinely there when everything else is removed. What was there when everything else was removed was considerable. She turned and went through the door. 3 years later, the Joint Commission convened for its formal inaugural session in the Dominion's Eastern Hall, a building Seraphina had helped design, with tall windows facing the valley and good stone that carried sound without distorting it, and a reading room adjacent to the main chamber that she had requested specifically because it had the same quality of light as the archive where everything had begun. The session opened with the formal reading of the Commission's name. The modified name, the one that carried both what it had been and what it had become, the one that told a small true story in a handful of words to anyone who knew enough of the history to understand it. Fenn represented the Ashthorn Empire. He sat across the table from her with the specific ease of two people who have been on opposite sides of significant negotiations long enough to develop the genuine respect that comes from having seen each other work under pressure. "The defensive coordination framework," he said, by way of opening. "The framework," she agreed. 3 years in the making and better for it. "The king sends his regards. Tell the king his regards are noted." She picked up her document. "And tell him the secondary Greyville approach still needs a permanent garrison. His border command has been running it on a rotational basis for 2 years, and it's creating a staffing inefficiency that his northern budget doesn't need." Fenn looked at her. "He said you'd say something like that," he said. "He was right." She opened the document to the first page. "Where would you like to begin?" "From the beginning," Fenn said. "We have time to do it right." She looked across the table at the Ashthorn Empire's best, and then at the room full of people from both empires and several of the independent houses that had joined the Commission's broader mandate, and beyond the tall windows at the valley where the trade roads ran through a continent that was, for the first time in 20 years, moving in a direction that was not primarily determined by two major powers watching each other with suspicion. It was moving in the direction she had pointed it, not alone. Nothing built to last is built alone. But with her name on it. With her full name, her full title, her full authority, in a room that had been designed to hold people rather than erase them. She turned to the first page. She began. What Ryker Ashthorn understood, in the years after the Greymere Summit, was something that most powerful people learn only when the cost of not learning it has already been paid. He understood that the things worth having cannot be had by holding them still. He rebuilt. Not everything. Some of what had cracked in the Ashthorn Empire during the years of misdirection and the months of the Eastern restructuring was genuinely, irreparably changed, and he learned to work with the changed shape of it rather than against it. He sent Fenn to the Commission. He established a formal advisory structure inside the palace that had clear lines and clear credit, where the people who did the work were named as the people who did the work, and where their contributions were not absorbed into the ambient competence of a well-run institution, but were attributed specifically to the specific people who had made them. Evelise left the court 2 years after the summit. Not in disgrace, she was too careful and too honest with herself for disgrace. She left in the direction of her own north, toward the independent territories where her particular skills had genuine application and where nobody expected her to be the thing she had tried to be inside the Ashthorn court. She sent Seraphina a letter before she went. It was 3 lines, and it said what it needed to say, and Seraphina kept it. Cullen worked for nobody important after the summit. The specific credibility damage of having run two channels simultaneously, exposed in a context as significant as the Graymere negotiations, was not the kind of thing that washed off. He understood this. He accepted it with the pragmatic resignation of a man who has made the calculation and lost and knows the calculation was his. Reth was different. Reth had been operating inside a faction that was larger than himself, and when Darius dismantled the faction with the particular thoroughness of a man who understood that incomplete surgery produces recurring infection, Reth found himself on the outside of an institution he had spent years assuming he was central to. He spent some time with that, and then he did the thing that some people do when the loss of position removes the scaffolding they've been using to avoid looking at themselves. He looked at himself. What he found was not entirely comfortable. He came back eventually with a different relationship to the idea of serving. Darius rebuilt nothing because there was nothing to rebuild. What he had built with Seraphina was not the kind of architecture that required reconstruction after the collective crisis. It was the kind that revealed its own quality under pressure and emerged from the pressure more certain of its shape than it had been before. The eastern expansion continued. The dominion grew, not in the aggressive, destabilizing manner of an institution that confuses size with strength, but in the slower, more durable way of something that is building to last. He and Seraphina worked together for many years, in the way of two people who have found the specific form of collaboration that makes both of them better than they are separately, and who have the intelligence and the self-awareness to protect that form rather than complicate it with other things it was not designed to hold. And Seraphina herself, Seraphina Vale, who had been the Luna of the Ashthorn Empire, and the most invisible important person in a court that mistook visibility for value, who had stood beneath chandeliers and smiled the smile of a woman who had finally understood something, who had walked out with two cases and a clarity, and had built, from the materials of her own knowledge and her own refusal to disappear, something that would outlast the people who had tried to make her small. She worked, she built, she put her name on things. Not because she needed to prove what she was capable of. She had stopped needing to prove it to anyone outside herself in approximately the third month after leaving, when the proving had become less interesting than the doing. She put her name on things because the work was real, and real work deserves its author. And she had spent long enough being the author of things that bore other people's names or no name at all. Years later, at the Commission's 5th anniversary session, a junior delegate from one of the newly joined Eastern Territories asked her, in the direct way of young people who have not yet learned to perform the question as smaller than it is, how she had built something this significant starting from nothing. She looked at the junior delegate. She thought about what to say. She thought about the archive, and the moon bond, and the ballroom, and the East Terrace, and the two cases, and the road. She thought about Darius in the corridor with the river water eyes and his patient waiting. She thought about Reth and the cold stone wall and the darkness of a floor she had not known was unstable until it moved. She thought about Ryker on the exterior steps at midnight, asking the question he already knew the answer to, because he needed to hear it said clearly enough to finally let it be over. She thought about all the specific, unglamorous, expensive work of becoming someone who could stand where she was standing. I didn't start from nothing, she said. I started from everything that had been taken away, which is different. Starting from nothing is easier. You have no idea what the losses cost, so you don't carry them. Starting from what you've lost means you carry every bit of it. She looked at the junior delegate steadily. The carrying is what gives you the foundation. You build on what you've survived, not on what you were spared. The delegate wrote it down. Seraphina turned back to the document in front of her. Outside the tall windows, the valley moved through its ordinary morning. The trade roads busy with the traffic of a continent that was mostly at peace with itself, and the mountain light coming in clean and direct and with no interest whatsoever in the history of the people it illuminated. She put her pen to the page. She worked, and that was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.